Okay, thank you. Welcome to everyone here and out via the live stream. This is the annual meeting of the Canadian Society of Presbyterian History. My name is Stuart MacDonald, and I'm currently the president of the Society. We have our program, so hopefully everyone has had a chance. We've got some great speakers. And what we're going to do is we're just going to follow through the program. We're going to have some announcements as we go along. We've asked our presenters to present, and then we're going to have some time for questions, and that's how we're going to proceed. You'll see we also have some displays in this room, and we'll get to those as we're going through the day. This is my first time in this role, and the thing I always discover is first time through is when you remember all the things you didn't think of to do. So I'm making a note for next year that one of the things I will do, and so watch out, folks, because I'll be asking you, is to invite other people to introduce the presenters. But I didn't think about that, and so I am not going to put anyone on the spot, so I am going to do that. So with apologies for you hearing my voice as much as you may end up doing that. Our first speaker, though, let's get right into our program. Our first speaker is the Reverend Dr. Bob Anderson. Bob has been a missionary. He's retired now. He's been a minister. I always think about his D.Min thesis, which was on ethnic ministry in Scarborough. It's in the Cavan Library. I just really found it helpful when I was doing some work on that. He's also published a great book on the evolution of our mission to Koreans in Japan, which kind of in some ways came out of the blue and unexpectedly right after Union. And today, the Reverend Dr. Bob Anderson is going to speak to us again about a mission topic, the Glasgow Colonial Society and the Reverend James Anderson. So I'm going to invite Bob to come up and address the group.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And I want to thank all of you for the invitation to address the Historical Society this morning. We have quite a wide spectrum of topics here this morning, and I'm looking forward to hearing the others, and I'm sure you are too. First of all, just look at our schedule here. You'll notice that we are scheduled to hear topics with a wide range of interests, one of which is dealing with everything from the far distant past to the immediate present. So I want to thank you for the privilege of having part of that story. When you all got a page of information before coming here, saying who was speaking and what they were to do, and the range of topics they're to cover. I was billed there as speaking on the Glasgow mission and the work of a certain Mr. Pringle. Now, unfortunately, I looked through all the sources I have. I couldn't find a Pringle eldest among them. There were several others that stood out, but he was not there. I see in the revised version that name is no longer there. But what I'm going to talk about, among other things, is the place of a certain Robert sorry. Robert Burns, yes. No, this is not the Burns of the wee, sleek-collared, timorous beastie. It's a different Burns entirely, no less significant, but one who is closer to the Presbyterian Church than the poet. And I have here a picture of him. If you look at him from there, you'll see that he is a hard-bitten old Scot with a will of iron. And that's exactly what came across in his ministry through the Glasgow Mission. The Glasgow Mission began in an upper room with a group of interested persons, thinking that there should be an organization of this sort to look after the expatriate Scots who had left Scotland to go to other parts of the world, particularly North America. To begin at the beginning, when was the Glasgow Mission brought into being, and who were those involved? To answer that question, we go back in history to the end of the Napoleonic War. The Scottish regiments had figured prominently in that war, and there's one group, the Scots Greys, who were a particularly fierce and effective instrument in the hands of the Allies against Napoleon. But then, when the war ended, there were a lot of Scots who served there, came back to Scotland, and found that there was no place for them. For one thing, Scotland itself was always economically depressed, and there is not much room for expansion. So some of these people went in a wave of immigration to the colonies. Just over the horizon was the empty continent of North America, the new land, the new world. And so a lot of them took up their resources, few as they were, and their families, if they had families, and they moved in the available shipping to the new world. And that is where the challenge for the mission came. They found when they got there that there were no churches. Now, every Scot knew that there were churches almost at every doorstep, in every town and village. There was a church of the Church of Scotland. And there were places for education. There were schools, there were universities. There's the wide hope of the things that Scots love most, their church and their learning. And so as a way of dealing with this, the Scottish community drew together under the leadership of this man to form the Scots Mission. It became known as the Glasgow Mission because they were all from Glasgow. Now, if you have ever had anything to deal with Scots, and I imagine most of you have, you know that when you have two Scots arguing together, you get three opinions. If you get several Scots together with Robert Burns, you end up with one opinion, his. And that's how it ran. He had others, advisors, he had people working with him, but he was the brains, he was the will, he was the man that got it done. And so we're looking at this Glasgow Mission, which is in effect the offshoot of the will and the activity of Robert Burns. Beginning with this small group and meeting in an upper room in Glasgow, the interest spread to others. They had as their goal three things: to provide ministry, to provide means of education, and to provide links with each other, because they were all there in disparate places and without inter-community communication. So these were the challenges that met this organization, the Glasgow Mission in the first place. It wasn't called the Glasgow Mission at first, but it became called that because the people were largely from Glasgow and they were largely interested in mission. The Glasgow Missionary Society, or the Glasgow Mission Society, recognized the pressing needs in the church of the church of their colonies. And some of who migrated to the colonies found, first of all, that there were no churches, no religious exercise organizations. And the comings they did from homes where these things were part and parcel of the Scottish scene. They set about immediately to try and fill the emptiness. Parallel to this was the need for some form of educational facility. Even the ordinary school where the children would grow up was not present. And remember, these people came from rural Scotland, which was largely Gaelic speaking. Now, the Glasgow Mission was charged not only with finding pastors and teachers, but those who were also bilingual in English and Gaelic. I don't know how many of you speak Gaelic. I suspect not too many. But in those days, the ordinary lingua franca of the community was Gaelic. And so the Glasgow Society was charged with finding bilingual people equipped to be pastors, equipped to be teachers, and willing to go to a strange land. No small order. And so they did, with zeal and with a great deal of success. Along with that, there was the desire to have books. Every Scot likes to read. Every reader likes to have books, his own or library of some kind. And so they were called to gather and to disseminate knowledge through books and through magazines. And you find the letters which came from the colonies, a desire above all to have children's books, Christian books, books for adults, books that could be read, could be circulated. And so these were gathered and they were sent. Some didn't get all the way there. Some were dumped to the ocean. It wasn't not intentionally, but out of that experience came the building up of libraries and making available to the people reading, people who could read others. They wanted Gaelic books, of course, but they'd settle for anything. And so a lot of them settled for books in English, which could be read and could be circulated. I have here a few books from that age, one of which looks as though it had been dunked to the ocean. This one, that is Roland's Geography. It's actually history and geography, and if you look at it closely, you'll find the pages tend to be stuck together. But I want you to notice too, as I was pointing out to a lady this morning, how small the type is. They must have had fantastic eyes to read that. I can't read it, of course, but there may be some here who can. This one deals with ancient history and very thorough reading. I think I would be somewhat ashamed to be taking an examination on the subjects which are covered here, because it's very wide and very deep. So that's one thing they wanted. They also wanted theological books, not just Bibles. They wanted Bibles too, and scripture portions for people to learn. They wanted copies of the Westminster Confession of Faith, which was the cornerstone of Scottish religious faith. They wanted stories about Christians, but they wanted them now, and they wanted them here, and they wanted them available to everybody who could read. So as the schools were proliferated, as there were more and more schools, there was a demand for more and more books, and these in turn were gathered and sent to various nodal points in North America. Now, trying to find these Scots was the next step. Where did the Scots settle? There were 2 or 3 places they went to particularly, starting in the eastern part of what is now Canada, at that time Lower Canada. The island of Cape Breton, where a lot came and where they spoke Gaelic, and don't you forget it, they're still speaking Gaelic there in some places. And and Prince Edward Island, and then further inland to New Brunswick and to Quebec, and moving west from there. These were the primary areas, but the mission didn't confine itself to those places. If you look at the map of Canada, of Eastern Canada, in those days, you'll find that the Ecumenical Mission had influence as far west as Toronto, as Ottawa, and up into the northern parts, the far north, as a place like Aurelia. And they sent their teachers, sent their pastors, and sent their instructors to all of these places. So I spoke of the three pressing needs. The fourthly, and this was a sensitive matter, the need for leaders who are fluent in Gaelic. The latter was critical, as many of the Scots had come from rural settings where Gaelic was a lingua franca. It is not all beer and skittles, however. There are difficulties, there is opposition, and there's needed a firm hand on the tiller to steer them through these rugged waters. And such a man was Robert Burns, who had a vision in which he tried to communicate to other people, and which he finally succeeded in doing. And with him was a group of people equally strong and equally well equipped, who would be his right-hand assistants in the process. Now, as regards the life and work of James Anderson and the church at Ormstown, this is the second part of my assignment. That is chiefly of interest to us as an illustration of how men were selected and by what means they were prepared for service. Notice we say how only men were chosen for ministry in those days, as they were for some generations later. The Glasgow Mission, at the beginning, made it clear that it was reaching out to minister to expatriate Scots. They had a very clear idea of who was in the kingdom. They were all Scots, and they were all Presbyterians. They would consider only ministers from the Church of Scotland as candidates. Church of Scotland was a very strong church, and it was about this time that they had a division, as the Scots tend to do, and divided into the Church of Scotland at the Evangelical Church. And this man was one of the mainsprings in the formation of the Evangelical Church in Scotland. They too had an interest in the expatriate Scots. They too wanted to send leaders. They too wanted to have schools for the children. They wanted to have a means of communication between group and group to provide a certain solidarity in their business, in their being there. A request came from Lower Canada for a missionary to do itinerary work along the St. Lawrence River. And one of their candidates was Reverend James Anderson. Now, notice they didn't, they were particular about how they picked their candidates. They only would take graduates from seminaries, people who were equipped with the true gospel, preferably a Scottish seminary, and they were sent out after having been examined thoroughly as to their doctrine and practice. Reverend James Anderson was a student of Glasgow. He had received his theological training in a Glasgow seminary, and he was examined as to his doctrinal correctness by members of the community of the organization. He was required to speak in two churches in Scotland, in Glasgow. Tron Church, a big church. If you've been to Scotland, you know it is a big church. It still is. And one of the other churches there, whose name I've forgotten. But he passed with flying colors and was sent to North America. When he got there, he was assigned by the church in Canada, by the organization which was requesting assistance. He was assigned to work as an itinerant minister along the shores of the Lake of St. Lawrence River, between Montreal and Three Rivers. This didn't last very long because about that time, the charge of Ormstown in Quebec became vacant. Now, that's another long story. There was a controversy there between the minister and Mr. Cahoon, and he went to Upper Canada and left the place vacant. The local organization in Quebec took this young man, James Anderson, and placed him in charge of the church at Ormstown. If you look at a map of Quebec, you'll find Ormstown is well inland. It was at that time a small village on the banks of the Richelieu River. And in that community, there were a mixture of Scottish, non-Scottish whites, French, and Indians. And his ministry was to these people. He was promised £50 a year, which was never really paid. It was to be paid all at once, and they didn't come across. But nevertheless, they loved him dearly, but not enough to pay him. It's not an unknown story here, I believe. The sources of pay were always a problem with the Glasgow mission. They had three sources. They tried to raise money themselves to support the missions in Canada. And then there were some funds came from the clergy reserves, and that's a long and very complicated story. And there were some funds raised by the local congregation, not much, because people there were also poor. And so once appointed, the missionary was often left on his own financially. James Anderson was one of these, and he had a horse. He had no car, of course. He had a horse, and he had to buy hay for the horse, which cost several pounds a year. He had a wide parish over roads that were minimal and which demanded his total attention and concentration even to get from point A to point B. The congregation was scattered through all of this territory. Now, along with the charge came a glebe of some forested land, uncleared, but given as part of all of which his pay was to come. And so he received this as well. While in Ormstown, he didn't have a house. He was promised a house, but didn't have one. So he built one. He's still a Scot, you know. And he built a house of sorts, which I believe is not there anymore, but there is a nice manse there. And he did his work thoroughly. He was dearly loved by his people, but not paid very well. And so they said of him later, they loved him dearly, but not enough to pay him. His ministry continued throughout the length of his life. He had only one charge, and he lived there from his first induction until his passing away some years later. He actually died in 1861. The charge at Ormston, by the way, continued after his death with a number of people. There's a Dr. A.E. Morrison, who became quite a figure in the Canadian Church, and he was there for the length of for the rest of his life too. And during his time, they built a large, a beautiful church, still standing, complete with a clock and a tower, which tolled and which still tolls. But it became, by the end of his tenure, it was the largest rural church in Upper Canada, and remains to be such. All of these things are included in the papers of the Glasgow Mission. And you'll find these in our own archives here today. I saw the shelf last week, quite an impressive collection of boxes with bound volumes in them, including 2 boxes full of the minutes and transactions of the mission itself, several boxes full of correspondence with missionaries, all of them in longhand. And you'll find I have here a Xerox copy of the kind of thing you'll see, longhand written in beautiful writing, with the details of the mission's activities and the names of those who were appointed and sent, and the ones who sent them. So we have a record. These are in our archives here in Toronto. For a long time, they were not in our hands. At the time of the Church Union, which I don't think anybody here remembers, they were placed in the archives of the United Church of Canada. After that, they were transferred to our archives, and they remain there today, watched over by our archivists, who are very careful to see that they're well preserved. And they're boxes full of papers just like this, which you can see if you go in there and give identification and so on, which you can see for your own reading. If you can read longhand, if you can understand the language, they are very instructive and very beneficial to all who would read. When the Presbyterian Church in Canada was formed in 1875, it no longer was under the direction and tutelage of the Glasgow Mission. But the Glasgow Mission has not been forgotten. We have churches throughout Upper and Lower Canada, and the offshoots from them into other parts of our nation. And we remember the people such as Robert Burns and those who steered the church in its first beginnings. As we look back at the history of these, we find the debt we owe to the people who left home, substance, and friends, often never to see them again, and gave their lives in the service of Christ and his church. That is the story of the Glasgow Mission. Just a small bit of it. So many other stories, so many other accounts of personal sacrifice and suffering, which came with those people who, because the church had decided to minister to her people in far places and preserve the faith which was begun at home, the people who benefited from the gifts and the person and the lives of these young people who carried the torch of Jesus Christ into the far parts of Western Canada. There's much more to the story than that, and I brought along a few sources here for those who like to pursue the matter. I've already shown you that book, which was pulled from the ocean and restored. Here is the major source the minutes of the Glasgow Colonial Society, but printed by the Champlain Society in Canada. This is a book which I think many of you have seen already, John Moyer's Early Presbyterianism in Canada. It's an excellent story to that. And of course, the standard history of all church histories, William Gregg's History of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. It's available in every library, every church library, and it's also in our archives if you want to see things there. These are stories that are often buried in the memories of people whose memories will fail. I beg that you will remember these, because, see, we have all benefited from this. The college here was built in that time. Robert Burns was a professor here. I'm not quite sure what he taught, but he was made professor of divinity, it's called. He was also a minister of Knox Church on Spillane Avenue, there for many years, which followed the tradition of the evangelical church in Scotland. But he was one of the men who spent his life in the service of the church and who is now remembered only in a rather thick and small print biography written by his son, The Life and Work of Robert Burns. I leave this with you then as a hook with a worm on it, to encourage you to look up the work and the long traditions of the Glasgow Mission Society, and to ask you to look at your own church, and if it is one of these, to give thanks. If it is not, to give thanks to those that were, and remember that our Lord Jesus Christ works in great and small ways through men and women in the far parts of our land. I shall leave these books available for you to peruse. And I thank you for the opportunity of coming today and speaking with you on this occasion and being part of this historical society. Thank you.
Questions for Bob? Questions
for Bob? Bob, just some comments and a question. It's interesting to me that the Glasgow Colonial Society, what was its date of origin when they first met in that upper room?
I'm sorry?
What was the date of origin when the Glasgow Colonial Society first met in the upper room in Glasgow? Was that about 1815, 1860, somewhere in there?
I believe it was 1822 they began.
1822. Because my comment is, it might seem strange to us in a way now that in that period, most mission societies, in fact all, began as not as a denominationally an initiative, but the initiative of just a group of private people, whether it was one within a denomination or interdenominationally. So interdenominationally, it was known as the Age of Societies, and this is in a way a typical example. So it's not that the Church of Scotland did this, but rather just a group of interested people meeting in Glasgow.
That's correct.
Yeah.
It was not the church as church.
Yeah. Yeah, and I had a couple of questions for you. One was, when the Church of Scotland split in 1844, did the society continue as to cover both the Church of Scotland and the Free Church? How did that work out?
I'm not acquainted with the activities after that time, but the society itself did continue for quite a while. I don't know exactly. It sort of dwindled out because the functions in which it was engaged were taken over by the denomination itself.
Right. Okay.
In later days.
Right. Another question for you. I may be making this up, but am I right in saying, or maybe you know or don't know, in that early period, the first half of the 19th century, am I right in saying that Ulster Presbyterian ministers were also recruited to come to Scotland through the Glasgow Colonial Society? I'm sure I heard that somewhere, or I just wanted to hear it. Yeah.
I'm not too, I'm not too conversant with the international relations. I know the Scots and the Irish didn't get along too well.
Did or didn't?
Didn't get along too well. But the Ulster Christians were also active in reaching their communities in Canada. Now, I can't tell you details of that, but I know that there was at that time, see, with the movement after the potato famine, there was a lot of people who left Ireland to form Irish communities as the Scots had formed Scottish communities. There was, it's reasonable to assume there'd be the same kind of concern for their well-being. But remember that the Ulster people, many of them were Catholic, and there wouldn't be the same motivation there that there was among the Scots.
But I think up until the 1840s, Presbyterian clergy in Ireland were all educated at the Scottish universities, and I think I'm pretty sure that many of them were recruited by the Glasgow Colonial Society as graduates of Scottish universities to come here. And they would have had the same names. I guess what lies behind my question is a long-term concern of mine, which I've done nothing about, is that often the Ulster Presbyterian contribution gets sort of hidden because it's usually just looked at as more Scots. Sorry. I want somebody to come bump into here and tell me something else, Stuart, or... but I think I'm trying to think. Did Alan Ferris write an essay some years ago on, I think it was Mark Stark coming to Dundas, and I think he was sent by the Glasgow Colonial Society, and I think I'm also right in saying that often those who were recruited were ministers who found it very difficult to get a paper. In that pre-1844 period, to get a position, you had to have a patron place you in a
I see.
And quite a few of those recruits to the Glasgow Colonial Society were men who could not find a patron.
I see. Well, I know one thing, there's not a lot of conviviality among Scots and Irish at that time, even though Ireland had a lot of Scots who moved over that way too. But there was a feeling of antipathy, which had nothing to do with religious faith. But you've opened up a subject of great interest to see the parallels between the Irish and the Scots transmission of faith and how it was handled. And that would be another subject entirely, which I'd love to pursue. Thank you.
The mic battery died, just so that everyone knows what was going on. So thanks to Terry for picking up on that. The whole question of Irish Presbyterians, I would agree with Clyde. That remains one of the things we really have to think about. And I'm concerned in our understanding of colonial period, we don't always get that. And it's just below the surface. So I think, Bob, you're right. It's hard to know what's going on there. The one thing I'd want to raise, though, is you made a really good point about the challenge of being paid. That he was paid £50 a year. Is that correct? That's what he was supposed to be paid.
At one point.
Yeah, but they really struggled to find this money. And I think that's one of the things that intrigues me, is starting to think through how they paid for these things and the challenge of raising the money. So as you've well described it, they're meeting as a volunteer society. They're putting their money in. They're trying to raise this money. The folks in Canada then take over the responsibility. But what kind of money are they making farming the rocks of Upper Canada in this period? Because some of the areas that they're farming, some are good, but some aren't that good. And it's settling, it's making through. So I think I think the financial piece is a really interesting one just to think through how much this would be, what a burden it would be, and just the whole challenge of trying to figure it out. So I think that was a really, really good point.
Well, while there was a certain amount of money involved, which just wasn't all forthcoming, there was also barter. And sometimes the people in the area would pay in wheat what was required of them. And this could, in course of time, could be sold and turned into cash. But nobody had money then. And for the Glasgow mission to think in terms of money was almost foreign to the reality of the settlers in Upper and Lower Canada. There's a good deal, as you know too, there's this question of the clergy reserves was a big problem. And some of that money went to the Presbyterians, a lot of it didn't. And so there's always a struggle there. There's a long story there with I forgot the name of the bishop, who seemed to have the control of the thing. Money was always a problem, it still is. But greater than it was now, because they just didn't have it. And you couldn't, and they said there was a theory that religion would pay for itself. That was kind of a byword. It never did. And nevertheless, the candidates for ministry, the missionaries who went from this and other organizations, went there in the name of Christ, and they lived according to what they could receive. Their first thought was proclaiming, spreading, and living the gospel. After that, they were willing to wait and suffer for the material things.
Bob, thank you for your paper. A question about Robert Burns that I probably should know this, and maybe I did know it at one time, but have forgotten. He comes he's deputized, I think, by the Free Church in 1843-44 to come to Canada or to Upper Canada. Now, was he one of the founding members of the Glasgow Colonial Society? And does he come, when he comes in 1843-44, he's involved in the founding of Knox College or becomes a professor here? As you said, he goes to become the pastor at Knox Church, where he was from 1844, I think, to 1856, and then he came to the college just full time. But what I'm asking is, does he come both on behalf of the Glasgow Colonial Society and the Free Church? Do you know just the terms of how he comes to be here?
I think he wore several hats. His basic loyalty was to the evangelical wing of the Church of Scotland, but in that capacity, he served on the Glasgow mission and in the churches here. But he had a lot to do with the building and the shape of the ministry of Knox Church, Spadina, as is still evident there. As a matter of fact, I remember hearing one gentleman in a downtown church say, Knox followed the evangelical wing, didn't they? and our church was stayed with the Kirk. Now, that may or may not be true, but it was a feeling that was still present, even in our own generation.
Yeah, I mean, Knox Church had been founded originally as York in 1820, and then it was really that church, together with some of the Free Church folks, who formed Knox in 1844. That's when it becomes Knox. And at any rate, it's thank you for that. I just think he's such an important figure, and it shows what's interesting to me is just how it shows how the Glasgow Colonial Society, the Free Church movement, really intersect in that period, and its significance for Canada,
yes.
or for the church in Canada.
Thank you.
Just go back to the point that Stuart was making. I don't know about Canada, but in the 1820s, when James Anderson was offered a position, presumably in Canada, at £50 a year, I don't know how £50 what it would have meant in Canada, but in Britain, that would have been quite attractive. In the 1820s, the average Church of Scotland minister or Anglican minister in England would have made between 50, maybe 50 if you're a curate, maybe under 50, maybe up to 100 if you're a rector or something. But it wasn't. That was a decent. Now, whether he ever received it or not is obviously dubious. But it would have been an attractive an amount in British terms for ministry in the 1820s. And probably in Irish terms, very well.
I'm going to invite people to keep talking to Bob and asking some further questions, but I just want to thank him for his presentation. We're going to take a 15-minute break. So thank you again to Bob Anderson for our first presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. McDonald, for the introduction. As he mentioned, this was Don McLeod's idea. So Don had the idea, I did the work. The title today, John Pringle, Minister of Highways. As Stuart mentioned, this year marks the centenary of the Reverend Dr. John Pringle's election as moderator of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. And after having researched the life of Dr. Pringle, as I have, I think it would be difficult to imagine his equal in our denomination when it comes to the varied ministry he had, or the degree of influence he exerted as a pastor, preacher, builder, missionary, public servant, and soldier, among other things. John Murray, in his book, History of the Presbyterian Church in Cape Breton, makes a telling statement when he says, in a chapter about St. Andrew's Church in Sydney, where Pringle served from 1908 to 1925, the space at our disposal is too limited to say anything adequately about Dr. Pringle and the work he has done for Canada and the Empire, as well as for the Church as a whole, and St. Andrew's Church in particular. Nothing less than a volume could do justice to that subject, and we forbear to touch it in this sketch of St. Andrew's and its ministry. And having researched this, I do ask myself the question, how does one capture the length and breadth of such an one as John Pringle? At a symposium about St. Andrew's Church, Sydney, held in 1948, a similar sentiment is expressed. So much could be written about him than there is to conform to the space at our disposal. Now, one posthumous work on Pringle exalts him quite significantly when it cites the Gospel according to St. John in chapter 1 and verse 6, which says, "There was a man sent from God whose name was John." The authors did not, it would appear, deem it an overreach to compare the rugged missionary to John the Baptist, the rugged prophetic forerunner of Jesus Christ. So this paper will be a mere scratching of the surface in its treatment of John Pringle's life and career. And it's hoped that at the end, we will have a fuller understanding of this largely forgotten Canadian Presbyterian or Presbyterian Canadian, a giant in every sense of the word. Pringle was born on the 7th day of June, 1852, in Murray Harbour South, Prince Edward Island. He was the son of a military man. He was the eldest in a large family, as they were then. His brother, George, also to become a Presbyterian minister, was the youngest. And so the elder Pringle quipped that because of their age difference, he and his brother were distant relatives. As a child, his father's regiment moved to Kingston, Ontario, and it was there that he experienced something of the military life that would mark his experience many years later as an officer in the Great War. Pringle entered Queen's University in Kingston in 1871, graduating with a BA in 1875, the same year that the Presbyterian Church in Canada came into being. He was ordained in 1878. In 1904, Queen's conferred upon him the honorary degree of Doctor of Divinity. And in 1933, 2 years before his death, Pringle addressed the students of his alma mater when he received his Doctor of Laws degree. Someone has said, if he had faults, and he did have them, they were the faults that went naturally with a personality such as his, the faults of a man possessed by a passion and zeal for the mental, moral, and spiritual uplift of his fellow man. According to the Great War Project of Canada, John Pringle enlisted for duty to the Empire on January the 25th of 1915 at North Tidworth, England. And remarkably, at the time of his enlistment, he was 62 years old. The War Project says that Pringle was 6 feet and 2 inches tall, had a chest width of 44 inches, and an expansion of 3 inches. One could truly say that Dr. Pringle was every inch a soldier. He entered the 9th Battalion Infantry as a private and a chaplain. He was promoted to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. He served in Canada, England, and France with the 9th Battalion, 17th Battalion, the 30th Battalion, the 1st Canadian Infantry Brigade, Shorncliffe Military Hospital, 1st Canadian General Hospital of Canadian General Depot, Shorncliffe, and Chaplain Services. And Pringle had the distinction of being the first chaplain of the Great War to be mentioned in dispatches. And this took place on November the 30th, 1915. And that dispatch reads as follows. Canadian Forces, Reverend J. Pringle, Chaplain, was mentioned in a dispatch from Field Marshal Sir John D.P. French for gallant and distinguished services in the field. I have it in command from the King to record His Majesty's high appreciation of the services rendered. And this is signed by the Secretary of State for War. During his retirement, which included being named Pastor Emeritus, Dr. Pringle took responsibility for Knox United Church in Blackett's Lake, which is just outside of Sydney. And it still stands with a prominent photo of Pringle on one of its side walls in the sanctuary. And towards the end of his life, a correspondent from a magazine called The Villager in New York, her name was Emmeline Page, attended a service at Knox Blackett's Lake at which Pringle presided. And this is part of her account. Some people think of the 1st Division when they think of John Pringle, for he wears the famous little red button in his lapel. But most people think of the Klondike and the Yukon, where Dr. Pringle is known from one end to the other. His long years of work are a part of the colorful history of that part of the world. And his sermon this morning to the 30-odd men and women and children who make up his congregation was an inspiration to cherish for days and days to come. Dr. Pringle is over 80 and looks a scant 65. His roadster, with its distinguishing blue and white cross, is a familiar sight on the highways of Cape Breton. And it is said that he knows more people than any other man in the Dominion. The fact that Pringle's son, John, had volunteered for service himself played no small part in Dr. Pringle's decision to enlist in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. His son came to make the supreme sacrifice in 1915. And obviously, as it would, this had a deep impact upon the elder Pringle. In an interview with R.E. Knowles of the Toronto Star, he said the following: "The most emotional moments of my life were in connection with my son. He walked 450 miles from the Peace River District to Edmonton to enlist for service, and then he gave his life at Passchendaele." In September of 1914, when Pringle addressed a gathering of his own congregation in Sydney, exceeding 1,000 persons, on the eve of his departure for the front, he said this: "It came home to me when my own boy tramped 500 miles to enlist and then told me he had done so. I saw my duty clearly was to minister to the spiritual needs of the men who had so nobly heard their country's call and had obeyed the summons." A man named Harold Peat, in an article entitled "Pringle, Father and Son," records the following about a service led by Dr. Pringle aboard the transport ship Zealand, which was later renamed the Northland, evidently because it sounded less German. He says this: "I went to the service. Maybe 400 of the men, all told, stood to attention as Major John took his place before us. I went because he was Jack's father. I went because Jack did. I went because I had nothing else to do. As a boatload of men, we were chary of sermons." The Reverend John Pringle told of the Trail of 98. He described to us that he had battled in company with other men against nature on the Yukon Pass. He told of Dawson, he told of mines and gold and fights and deaths and conquerings. And here he was on the trail again, Major John. The deck would not hold the men who crowded up for the next service. No, sir. We wanted stuff like this, and we got what we wanted, and the dredge of the master miner went to work on the sifting of our souls. Reverend James Fraser was a student assistant to Dr. Pringle at St. Andrews when it was St. Andrews Presbyterian Church. And Fraser later described Pringle this way: "Splendidly handsome, kind, and dignified. Too much praise cannot be given. He honored me with a lasting friendship, and the love I bore for him never relaxed." James Fraser later named one of his own children Pringle. And Pringle Fraser later became a United Church minister. Now, Pringle Fraser was born on June the 9th, 1925, and I had the privilege of knowing him in his later years. And you might know that June 9th, 1925 was the day before Church Union in Canada. And so Pringle would always say that he was Presbyterian for a day. In 1919, the General Assembly, as we've noted, in recognition of his self-denying services, elected Pringle as moderator. And during his term of office, he presented the claims of the church far and wide in every province of the far-flung Dominion but one. Pringle, among other things, was noted as a great speaker and preacher. I want to share with you a few words that he gave in an after-dinner speech that go like this. But it's my purpose tonight to play the role of the historian rather than the much more difficult one of a prophet. and turn your thoughts to the past. I would like to briefly point out at least 3 fields in which the church has pioneered. And the 3 words for this are light, liberty, and love. With reference to the early Christians, Pringle writes this: instead of cultivating the ancient and honorable profession of fighting, these deluded creatures illuminated manuscripts, daubed on walls, composed music, designed and erected fantastic structures. Never once in the records of Rome or Constantinople can you find mention of the erection of a single public charitable institution. Dig down into the tomb of old King Tut and his tribe. Interview those who have come back from excavating anywhere on the face of the earth. And nowhere will you find a single reference to any charitable institution for the alleviation of pain and suffering until after the time of Christ. As we've noted, Pringle is known most especially for being a missionary to the Yukon, among so many other things that he did in his life. In an article from a paper of St. Andrew's College in Winnipeg, we read this: Dr. Pringle is ready for a race with any man in the world on snowshoes. And he has a dog, too. His name is Telegraph, from Penetanguishing, a St. Andrew's dog who forms with his paws the cross of our patron saint every time he lies down. Chatting with the boys, singing hymns with them in the evening, and going with them in prayer to the throne of grace, telling them stories, and in every way possible to me, he writes, helping them to be better and of good cheer. And part of Pringle's humility was something he also wrote. They helped me also. I was always able to pick up something out of my fellowship with them, and so helped my own life. Some of the following words are descriptive of the kind of situation in which pilgrims to the Yukon in Pringle's day found themselves. The drink shop, the gambling saloon, and the brothel, foul trinity of ill will abound. And if left uncared for, multitudes of young men from good homes will fall victims. Of the greatest importance, therefore, is that the church be on the spot from the first and remind our boys of home and heaven. A crowd of goal seekers on the wing need the gospel more than any other mass of men I ever met. There are the reckless, the indifferent, the professing Christian without a backbone, the earnest Christians, the discouraged, the despairing, good and bad men. They all need Christ very much. One of the things that Pringle wrote and said was his appreciation of the work of nurses. The work of the nurses for 1 month, he wrote, has done more to make people believe we have the Spirit of Christ than a year's preaching could. The great gentle ministering of our nurses will open many a heart to the gospel and the Spirit of Jesus. Pringle had not only humility, as I've discovered, he also had humor, and I want to share one of those incidents with you. He visited Union Theological Seminary in New York, and he visited there with Professor F.E.F. Scott, whom Pringle had known from Queens in Kingston. And it was known that Scott was a heavy smoker. So when he was there on his visit, Pringle looked at Scott's desk and he said the following: Dr. Scott, as an old Queens graduate, I'm glad to see you are here. Your presence is comfort to us in Canada. We send many of our boys here for graduate work, and it worries us that sometimes they pick bad habits, smoking, for instance. Pringle then pointed to 6 or 7 pipes on Scott's desk and said, I'm glad to see that you are taking their pipes from them. Someone once wrote, "I have seen as many as 2,000 gather to hear a popular American preacher on a summer evening, and when Dr. John Pringle visited a camp, no hut would begin to hold the crowd that surged to hear him." John Pringle also played a large part in the formation of the Women's Home Missionary Society. While stationed in Atlin, British Columbia, Pringle came to realize that gold rush miners were not immune to such diseases as typhoid and pneumonia. There was no formal hospital in the area. There were no health professionals to diagnose illnesses or administer treatments. So Pringle appealed for 2 Christian nurses to fill the void in healthcare. And so as a result, on the 15th of March, 1898, the Atlin Nurses Committee was organized in Toronto. This committee played a leading role in the formation of the Women's Home Missionary Society in 1903. Miss Elizabeth Mitchell and Miss Helen Bone responded to the appeal and took up the cause in Atlin. The government agent gave them a cabin for a hospital. The cabin consisted of a mud roof, a floor of sawdust, and 2 small panes of glass for a window. It had 4 cots with hay-filled pillows. Imagine. And in 1900, St. Andrew's Hospital was built, and I think it was the first Presbyterian mission hospital in Canada. Prospectors, of course, were of necessity itinerant. John Pringle, as well as his brother George Pringle, moved with them. They had an undeniable ministry of presence to the miners. John once wrote, "There are scores of outlying points which we cannot touch and no one else thinks about. I wish the Home Mission Committee would appoint a good man for El Dorado who could preach and visit and let me loose to have the untouched and outlying districts as my parish, districts inhabited mostly by prospectors. These faraway boys appreciate a minister's visits as mothers do." Pringle was one of the most tangible examples of what would have been called in those days muscular Christianity. John Moyer, to whom Dr. Anderson referred earlier, notes, and I quote, "Pringle made a 3-week winter trek to Fort Wrangell, tramping through slush up to his knees, and eating the netting of his snowshoes to stay alive. By the time he reached his destination, his hands were so torn by thorn bushes that for 3 days he could not hold a pen." As I mentioned earlier, not only was Pringle a man of humor, but a man of humility as well. Despite his many accomplishments, and there were many, his larger-than-life persona, and it was, Pringle was swift to give credit where he felt credit was due. Found a little letter in a book written on November the 16th, 1915, written from France when he served there. And he says the following to an unidentified young girl named Jenny, who was somebody in his church in Sydney. He says in part, "My heart just goes right out to God for you all. Blessings on your dear young hearts and lives. The girls and boys of Sydney kept my heart from getting old and sour and hard. So you were God's blessing to me." Wherever he was, and that was a lot of places, John Pringle never forgot where he came from, never failed to remember anyone whom he felt made a positive contribution to his life. Pringle ministered not only to the spiritual needs of the prospectors, but also to their physical requirements. He did his part to attend to the whole person, and in most cases, at that time and in that situation, the whole man. One of the common diseases at the time was scurvy. And in the history of the hospital, it states that Pringle's treatment was, quote, raw onions and raw potatoes, and they soon recovered. Sounds delicious. What was a typical day on the trail, if there was such a thing, for John Pringle? I want to quote to you in his own words how a typical day might have unfolded for him in the Yukon. He said, "I take my morning wash in snow, stir the oatmeal into the boiling water, chop a wedge of beans out of the pot, and put it into the frying pan to thaw and warm, and make the coffee. A few verses from my Testament, my only book, a few requests at the throne of grace, and I'm ready for breakfast, and it for me. Porridge, bacon, beans, hardtack, coffee, sometimes with milk and sugar, sometimes with one, sometimes with neither. At noon, I have gone perhaps 10 miles, and am not tired but hungry. On a little shelf formed by the roots of a fallen tree, I build a fire, melt some snow, and make a cup of tea. My pockets hold half a dozen ship biscuits and 3 or 4 slices of fried bacon. These, with tea, are my lunch. And when I have partaken, the trail does not look so hard. Grace before meat means more on the trail than amid the comforts and pleasures of the old conventional life. So I move on hour after hour until 3 o'clock, the sun's edge touches the horizon, and now I must stop if I would camp in comfort. The dogs are let loose, a spot is trampled in the snow for the tent, a tree is felled upon the site of my new home, the branches cut off to make a floor, end and ridge poles for the tent carried in, a couple of short sills make ready to keep the stove from sinking into the snow. And in 30 minutes, I am at home, a fire going and supper on the way. Look into the tent at 11 o'clock. You will see the minister reclining on his blankets, reading his testament by the light of a candle stuck in the corner of his grub box. A verse or two of Son of my soul, thou Savior dear, and he is off into the land of rest and dreams. 3 or 4 days of this, Pringle wrote, and a cabin is reached where a man lies helpless as a mummy, he says, in his bunk, scurvy. A day or 2 for rest, and then the return journey begins. The sick man is lashed on his blankets on the minister's sleigh. Not much, perhaps, in all this, no preaching, but a life is saved. And the gospel that reveals God in Jesus as man's friend is commended to hundreds who never knew or had forgotten. Anyway, it was obedience in part to him who commanded, preach the gospel and heal the sick. I want to share with you a poem. It's a poem entitled Thanksgiving Day Service in Cal Braith's Saloon. And some of its verses go like this. Thanksgiving Day, down Telegraph Way in the winter of '98. And the boys from the Junction and Summit had come down to celebrate. For though it was snowing and blowing and howling to beat the band, when Parson Pringle dealt the cards, all the boys took a hand. For he wasn't one of them gospel sharks or a collar and necktie swell that tries to scare you into heaven with visions of red-hot hell. So he ran his sluice boxes up the hill to Salvation Creek above. He washed the dirt of our sordid souls in the waters of God's own love. So Cal Braith's store was plump, jam full, and the singing was good and strong. And the parson gave us his little bit and did not keep us too long. Pringle got his hands dirty. He got his clothes soiled. He feared no foe when it came to reaching, quote, gamblers, robbers, evildoers of every description, whose chief aim was to prey upon their fellow men and to stir up trouble at every opportunity. One situation that Pringle ran into during the Klondike Rush was at a roadhouse, and he describes this situation like this. One of those gangs had taken full charge, and being armed, had the staff at their mercy. They drank freely, and of course the profanity was shocking. In the morning, the real trouble commenced as there was very little on hand for breakfast. And after being seated around the table, I looked those men straight in the eye and I said to the men, "This food looks good enough to ask God's blessing upon it." I never saw, nor did I hear, of any more trouble. He had a communion service. His account of it said this: there were 34 men and 4 officers at the service. This is when he was during the First World War. There was no table, so they fitted one up with 2 chairs and a door of the stable lifted off its hinges. It was not so inconsistent as it first appeared, for he whose love was commemorated that day was born in the stable. It was quite in harmony. At this point in my talk today about Pringle, I'd like to get into some juicy tidbits, if you will. It goes like this. Dr. Pringle moved from the Yukon, from the west to the east, in about 1909. And that was probably no coincidence, as you're going to see. May have been, his move, the direct result of allegations of corruption and vice that he directed towards members of the Yukon government. Dr. Clarence McKinnon, in his book Reminiscences, refers to Pringle's address at a General Assembly, and he said, Dr. John Pringle had come hot foot from the Yukon with a story of maladministration and immorality that made the country wince. Dr. Pringle's ministrations involved not only the individual salvation of the souls of men, but also the social good of the territory. He ministered spiritually, he ministered physically, he ministered socially. This resulted in one of the biggest battles of his life. Pringle came to experience for himself that old adage, you can't beat City Hall. Someone wrote, exposed to every form of attack that iniquity could devise, and literally taking his life in his hands, Pringle carried the fight for moral and social righteousness through the Yukon Council, then to the federal administration. Reacting to his detractors, Pringle stated, I shall meddle in politics as long as the devil meddles in politics. In March 4th, 1908 issue of the Dawson Daily News, the lead article of the paper that day has a revealing title, Yukon Spice Box in Parliament. The commissioner of the territory at that time was Alexander Henderson, and he's quoted in the piece as follows, I unhesitatingly affirm that the Yukon, including Dawson, is as moral in all respects as any other part of Canada. Before my arrival in the territory, I had heard that the question of dance halls had been brought prominently before the public through a letter addressed to a Winnipeg newspaper by the Reverend Dr. Pringle. In fact, things became so hot at this time that someone had brought and was threatening to bring a libel action against John Pringle for his seen as meddling in political affairs. The Winnipeg Telegram, 1910, spells out a few things about this situation. The author says, it was alleged that John Pringle, a man of spotless character, had frequented houses of prostitution in the Yukon and was therefore himself tainted with the vice which he condemned. Someone mentioned to me, I didn't exactly find it in any book, but the last minister of St. Andrew's Church in Sydney knew a bit about Dr. Pringle, and he mentioned that quite often if John Pringle was on one side of the street and a lady of the night was walking by on the other, she would shout over to him, "When are you coming to see me again, John?" So you can imagine. Someone else who's involved in Pringle's story is someone who's very familiar, and more familiar to Canadians than him. It would be C.W. Gordon, whom you might know by his pen name, Ralph Connor. And the Winnipeg article says this about Ralph Connor, C.W. Gordon. He says, "He had not a word to say in defense of Reverend John Pringle, not a lance to break in behalf of the outraged name of the Presbyterian Church. Calmly, he saw Reverend John Pringle driven from the Yukon, broken and penniless, for no other offense than courageous devotion to duty." And the article doesn't stop there. In a final shot across Gordon's bow, it becomes very personal. It says, quote, "Reverend C.W. Gordon is a millionaire, but if he was one of those who contributed to the amelioration of Reverend John Pringle's misfortunes, his generosity is not a matter of record." So it seems, perhaps a coincidence, maybe not, that at that particular time in his life, John Pringle, to say the least, needed a change in his life and in his location. And so he accepted a call to St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in Sydney, Cape Breton. He entered upon his new mission with zeal, and the response to him was met with equal zeal from the congregation. Imposing man that he was, Pringle was said to have filled the pulpit of St. Andrew's with his manly proportions, but he filled the church as well. And early in his tenure, it became necessary to build a new St. Andrew's. The old one was inadequate for the growing number of faithful who made their way to Sunday worship. The congregation had grown prior to Pringle's time, but he had built himself on the momentum. The minutes of session for May 26, 1909 record the following, quote, "In view of the moderator's intention to attend the General Assembly, which meets this year in Hamilton, Ontario, arrangements were made for the supply of the pulpit during his absence. It was also agreed that a meeting of elders and managers be called for the purpose of systematically canvassing the congregation for subscriptions in aid of the new church building." So while he attended the assembly, Pringle met with an architectural firm in Toronto and returned with plans upon which the new St. Andrew's was built. And it was dedicated to the glory of God on June the 26th, 1911, and for many years stood, as someone wrote, a memorial to his zeal. It's interesting, at the end of Pringle's ministry at St. Andrew's came in 1925, at the beginning, of course, of the United Church of Canada. Both he and the congregation entered the Union. Yes, it was the end of his work in Sydney, but not the end of his missionary endeavors. Eventually, he went to the North Thompson Valley in British Columbia, 73 years old. And as it was put, he laid aside his pulpit clothes and manners and again donned the togs of the trail. And this verse was written to sum up Pringle's pioneering spirit when he went west again. "Here's a welcome home to the West, old scout, where a man's man ought to be. The F at East may be good for some, but was never meant for thee." John Pringle was elected moderator, as we've noted, 1919, when it met here in Hamilton, Ontario. The minutes of that assembly record the election. Principal McKinnon moved that Lieutenant Colonel John Pringle, D.D., minister of St. Andrew's Church, Sydney, NS, be chosen moderator. The motion was seconded by Principal Baird, and there being no other nomination, the motion was carried unanimously, and Dr. Pringle was declared elected. Perhaps the most significant action of the assembly over which Pringle presided that year was the establishment of something called the Forward Movement. It included evangelism, missionary education, a social concern, and a special peace thank offering. After the tragedy and uncertainty of the First World War, the denomination no doubt felt the need for a new beginning. The chairman of the committee of 50, Dr. Alfred Gangier, put the urgency of the Forward Movement like this: "We are on the threshold of a new and larger manifestation of the kingdom of God on earth, but everything depends on this. Do we know the day of our visitation? And who knoweth if we are come to the kingdom of God at such a time as this?" Several $1 million was raised in, quote, "devout gratitude to God for victory and the possibility of a new start for the British Empire and a war-cursed world." Dr. Pringle was commissioned to go from September to the end of the year to campaign for the Forward Movement, giving such service as he only can give. Great confidence was placed in him. I've called today's talk John Pringle, Minister of Highways. And I get that title from this quotation: "Widely known by reputation, he toured the land throughout its length and breadth, and thus became an actual living personality to thousands where heretofore he had been more or less of a legendary figure. So constant was the demand for his services, and especially during this period of his moderatorship, that he became affectionately known as the Minister of Railways. Later on, when motor cars and greatly improved roads made travel by that means comfortable and safe, as well as speedy, this title was changed to the Minister of Highways." Reverend Dr. John Pringle died in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1935 at the age of 83. He had gone there to seek treatment for an illness of several months' duration. And as a Sydney newspaper of the time put it, "There is general rejoicing that he had lived so long, and general sorrow and regret that he has died." And Pringle is interred outside of Sydney in a graveyard where many people are interred, but the cemetery is called the John Pringle Cemetery. I want to close this morning with this quote from his brother George. You'll remember he was a distant relative. And he wrote a book called Adventure in Service, and he dedicates this book to his brother John with this verse: "No one could tell me what my soul might be. I sought for God, and he eluded me. I sought my brother, and I found all three." I just want to say in closing that we have in Sydney a museum. It's called the Old Sydney Society. And quite a few of the articles that Dr. Pringle owned are housed at the Old Sydney Society. Some of them I've seen, some of them I haven't seen yet. And one of them I know is a pair of snowshoes, and I'm hoping someday to find those. And he no doubt used them on the Yukon Trail. I believe a preaching robe is there. And the minister whom I mentioned earlier, the last minister of St. Andrew's United Church in Sydney, told me that his walking stick is there as well. And when he was older and living in Sydney, he used to go up and down Charlotte Street, the main street there, with his cane, and he used to whack the young people with it if he found that they were being vagrant or could be up to more profitable activities. I don't think you're allowed to do that today, but he did then with his walking stick. And so I think John Pringle is a larger-than-life figure, largely forgotten, and I want to thank Don McLeod for suggesting this topic. It was a fascinating study, and I hope you've enjoyed it too. Thank you.
Thank you, Richie. A couple of just factual questions. You said he graduated BA from Queen's. I'm assuming he did his theology at Queen's as well?
I think so.
Yeah, afterwards?
Stayed there and graduated 1875.
Yeah, okay. And then did he go to the Yukon immediately from
No, he served here in Ontario somewhere, and he also served in the States. He was in Minnesota, and he served in a congregation where some of the parishioners were the Mayos, as in the Mayo Clinic.
Right.
And I know he served there, and I think from there he went on to the Yukon.
To the Yukon. And then the last question is, I'm assuming he went into Church Union. He would have been retired at that point,
He became a minister of the United Church of Canada, and in the latter part of his life, he served in this little church called Knox United, which is still there. It was sort of a two-point charge for many, many years, St. Andrews United, Knox United. And Dr. Pringle lived in that area, and he ministered in that church quite regularly. And St. Andrews United, by the way, is called the Highland Arts Theatre now. It's a theatre. But that's the building that he built.
Thank you.
Okay? What took you so long?
I was hoping somebody else would say something. When listening to the first half of your talk, I kept on thinking, gosh, he sounds like a sort of twin of Charles Gordon, And so I was totally fascinated when you mentioned that they'd actually crossed swords.
Paths, yes.
So do you know any more about that, perhaps even at the time of union? Because obviously they both went into in 25.
Because Gordon was moderator too at some point, I think. C.W. Gordon. Now, I think it was him who wrote the book, The Life of James Robertson, who was a superintendent of missions in the Northwest and so in the West. And he only gives, in the whole book, he only gives one line to John Pringle after all that he had done in the West. And all it says is that he took 3 months leave of absence for health reasons. It made him look weak. And that's all he says about it. They obviously hated each other. I would think, I don't know any more about it than that. But the Winnipeg Press or whatever was scathing in its denunciation of what things that Gordon had said and done to Pringles. They obviously did not get along.
Right. Any other light to be shed on Charles Gordon? No, because I mean, I enjoyed his books very much when I was much younger, and on occasion since then, I've heard rather scathing things about Charles Gordon. He wasn't quite as muscularly Christian sometimes as one would have liked. But.
I don't have it in my paper, but the minister I referred to earlier, when Pringle went to the Yukon, his wife wouldn't go. And they were basically separated. This is in the 1890s, which would be very unusual in those days. And Pringle, in Blackett's Lake, where he's buried, is there by himself. There's nobody else with him. So his wife and he apparently, she said to him, look, it's the Yukon or it's me. He said, it's the Yukon. See ya. But that's how it happened, apparently. So there you go. Everybody has their skeletons. Yeah.
The next part of the program is just a very brief, that's what I'm hoping anyway, from my point, and then a little bit of conversation. I click it? Yeah, presentation, thank you. I missed that. Just related to research in Presbyterian history. So I've kind of titled it a research update. Over the last few years, there's been some discussion, some questions about the interest in and purpose of denominational history, specifically in our case, Presbyterian denominational history? Do people care anymore? Do students, MDiv, or graduate students care? Is there an interest in history? My answer is a clear yes, but with a caution. Interested, but the approaches they might take, the questions they might ask, and the topics they might be interested in might be quite different from some of the ones we've had in the past. And so it struck me that this might be a bit of an opportunity just to make a few comments about the research that's being done, as well as noting some areas we might or could explore. So where are we, and where might we be going? So there's a timeline up on the screen, and you'll see there's 1775 at one end and 2015 at the other. Now, we should really be 2019, but the computer wouldn't do that, so just bear with me. So the history of the Presbyterian tradition in Canada can really be broken down quite easily into three areas, three fairly distinct periods. We start from roughly 1775 down to the current day. And the first period I would want to say is the colonial period. That's when we see the first missionaries, the Glasgow Colonial Society, the first churches, and the different traditions coming to what will eventually become Canada. And they gradually form the denominations that are the antecedents to the Presbyterian Church in Canada. The second period starts with the formation of the Presbyterian Church in Canada in 1875, and it goes up to the church union crisis of 1925. And then the final period is everything after 1925. Now, most, not all, but most books and articles and biographies we have, the majority of them are focused in these first two periods, the creation of the denomination and then the early years of the denomination. Now, the debates about whether or not to go into church union and what happened leading up to 1925 have clearly been a major topic. As I tell my students, church union has been a mountain, both in terms of what we've written about it and also in terms of its importance. And like a mountain, as it's approaching, it becomes more and more clear and dominates more and more the landscape. And even once you're past it, you keep looking back. It's really shaped the entire experience. And I think that's the case for the 1925 Union has really dominated the landscape. It's so dominated the landscape that the post-Union period has received less historical attention. Now, I know this is changing, but this is the period where we've not, for a variety of reasons, paid a lot of close attention. To use another metaphor, we've treated it like the second act of a musical, where all the great songs were in the first act. There's a lot of musicals like that, by the way, where all the great songs, all the ones you know are in the first act, and you come to the second act and you go, yeah, nothing here. And you go home singing the songs from the first act. The problem is, in this post-Union period, the act just keeps going on and on. It's 94 years, almost a century, since 1925. It's 74 years since the end of World War II. There's a lot here. There's a lot happens in this period, and we need to pay attention to it. And I would suggest when we do, I think we see there's more going on than we might have realized. The songs may be different, but once we pay attention, we may discover that they're better than we actually thought they were. By the way, that was my experience of the musical Hamilton, if anyone's at least listened to the soundtrack. It was the first act really grabbed me, right? And it took a while to realize how great the second act is. And so we need to think about what's in this period. Now, I know this is a characterization, perhaps an exaggeration. There is good work happening in the post-Union period, and there's more that could be done and needs to be done in the colonial period as well as the period from 1875 to 1925. But I would also suggest that there's some truth to the fact that the period since church union is one we've neglected, and it's one we need to start thinking about, encouraging research in, supporting research in, and just talking about. And one of the other things we should just note, particularly if we're interested in students, and both MDiv and graduate, is for them the 1960s is in many cases before their experience, or the 1980s. So when we're thinking like everything important happened before 1925, that really doesn't invite them in. And so I think this is one way to think about our how we've done our history and to think about some potentials for research. So I just wanted to pick up on 3 suggestions very briefly where I see some areas where I see real potential for research. Biography, I think, as we've clearly seen this morning, is a very useful way to look at history. We need to keep doing biography. And one area in need of research, I think, relates to biography, and that's missionary biographies, particularly overseas missionary biographies. Now, either of individual missionaries or collective biography, looking at an entire mission field. I think there's a technical word for collective biography. I think it's something called prosopography. I think that's what that word means. But people are now talking about this, how you do a collective biography of a group. Now, I want to say this because we have great resources to do this. We have sources for this. One of the sources we have is previously written mission biographies. We have a huge section up in the Cavan Library that relates to this. So can we go back and look at what people have written, but look at it differently? Can we look at the sources and the mission reports and try to put that together? And what I'm talking about here is not, some of the mission biographies we'll find from the past are almost saints' lives. And I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about biography, not hagiography. Looking at these missionaries, placing them in the mission field, seeing how they work, and not just the 1 or 2 or 3 big names, but looking at what did the entire Chinese mission field look like, or the entire mission field in Taiwan or Korea. So that's just a thought. And I think we're place the ministries in their context, try to understand them, both the positives and the negatives. So I think that's an area that has enormous potential. And we're just beginning to see a few people looking at that. The second potential area of research, I think, relates to using new technologies. Computers and technology can be used as tools to answer questions, to raise questions, and allow us to see things in ways we haven't seen them before. And I think that's something we need to just think about. We don't use technology, I would suggest, just to use it. I'm not interested in that. But there's times and places where it really gives us tools that we didn't have before, and we can now do things with them. And let me give you a very real example. And the topic is rebuilding after the 1925 creation of the United Church of Canada. So what's left? How do we rebuild? What's the impact of that decision on the continuing Presbyterian Church? We all know that there were regional differences, and we all have this vague sense of it. But computers and software and the kinds of things we can do fairly easily now, or start them and then resort. That's what computers do. They just allow us to put data in and then just play with it. What we can do is what we can see, and what you'll see up on the slide here is the top one is the regional distribution, I believe, of congregations in the, charges. The blue is charges. The gray is communicant members, and the orange is Sunday schools. And you can see that across the denomination. At the top is the 1924 before church union, and after is 1927. Gave it a few years just to sort out. Now, the obvious thing you're going to notice in that is the church disappears in the West. Now, we already knew that, but this is the kind of thing that gives us the tools that we can then look at and try to understand what that would mean to study this, so we can use the data in order to look at it. It really makes the impact in, I think, a far more dramatic way than just saying, well, we lost a lot of churches in the West. And you can even do this with the technology now using computer maps. So this is a map. Hopefully you can see it. All of those red dots in Saskatchewan, or those are all presbyteries. In 1924, before church union, there were 15 presbyteries in Saskatchewan, and that's where they are. In 1925, after church union, there were 3. And so a computer map allows us to see these. It's not the only thing we're going to do, but it gives us a tool to start asking questions. More intriguingly, these are the congregations of one presbytery before union. And by the way, there's a hole right in the middle there. I suspect there were congregations there, but I can't even find the communities those congregations were going to be in. That's a problem with this. But so that's what you have. Afterwards, these are all the Presbyterian congregations in all of Saskatchewan that are left. And the blue is one presbytery, the green is another, and the red is the other. You can see the 3 presbyteries. And where we are, right there, that's where there were all of those. There's only 2 congregations from that entire presbytery left. And I've kind of put the ghosts of them up there, just for you to see. Now, I'm not sure all of what we would do with this. What I'm just trying to suggest is these are tools. Technology sometimes can be used to give us new insights, to new forms of analysis. I don't think we should be afraid of it. One of the things it makes very clear is what a job it was rebuilding after 1925. And I don't think the Presbyterian Church in Canada has taken that nearly seriously enough, particularly in certain regions. The other thing is we have underestimated the impact of church union in the Maritimes. And when we start to look at the loss of entire presbyteries in the Maritimes, I think we'll see again the task of rebuilding, how enormous that was. So technology raises new questions, and I don't think we should be afraid of using it. My one final suggestion, as I just say some things that I think would be helpful, is research using different sources. And Anne and I did not have this plan, but the timing is perfect. You'll see examples of those on the display at the back. I pop in frequently to our library here, and I know how much work they've been doing putting together our collection of Christian education materials. Why have historians not taken seriously or seriously enough Christian education materials as sources for telling us what's going on in the church? Not only what we're teaching children, but how we're understanding the faith that we are teaching to children. changes in Christian education approaches, materials, attitudes, values, how people are being portrayed. These are all really rich sources, and they haven't been used that much. What's fascinating is the last few years we've had several students do papers on these, and there really are rich sources. So you can see examples of this. But that's another thing that I think we just want to look at. What about worship books and hymnals and the changes in worship? We had a discussion in faculty in just kind of an open meeting, but just realizing that we have understandings of worship. Are they historically correct? We now tend to think the worship that we see is the worship we've always had. That's not true. And so thinking that through and thinking through the changes, that's another topic we could do. So those are just 3 quick things I wanted to share. I think this really is an exciting time. What we need to do is encourage people to work in perhaps historical periods we haven't focused as much attention on. Stuff did happen after 1925 that we really should think about, as well as new sources and new approaches. So I wanted to present that. If there's any questions or conversation, we can just have the mic and do that. I think Terry took it back, and Terry's probably on a break. So we're just going to do it here, and I'll try to repeat it for anyone. Okay.
Dr. McDonald, you talked about the resources of the overseas mission. I wonder how many here know about Vision Fellowship. Vision Fellowship is Korean. Okay, thanks. Vision Fellowship is at Lakeshore Road and Kipling area, and it has been set up by the Korean Church to recognize the mission to Korea. And just last year, in September, they opened the Japan section, and they have all kinds of resources there. And how many have visited it? That's what I thought.
I referred somebody to visit that site.
Yeah, they have numerous Koreans, young Koreans coming in every day that they're open to learn more about the history and particularly the connection between the Presbyterian Church in Canada and the Korean Church in Korea and in Japan. Because we were among the first as Presbyterians to go into Korea.
Stuart, this has been very interesting, just what you presented, because I mean, it's in its way, yeah, it's obvious you're right, and perhaps we need to pay far more attention to the 20th century. Just another area of maybe particular research that might be interesting is just what I would call new church, the whole new church development of the 50s. And I remember talking years ago to Joe McClelland, who was talked about this in Montreal and the huge expansion in there in the 50s. And this was when we were busy closing congregations. And he had been against it then. He was still against it in a sense, and was worried and wrote about it at the time. But I never did read what he wrote in the 50s about asking questions about all this new church congregations being built. But that'd be an interesting area of research.
Well, it is, and so at the risk of blowing my own horn, that's one of my main areas of research actually at the moment, and where I got into the computer mapping was in order to try to do that. And so I presented it on that to the Canadian Society of Church History.
So are you hoping to write, will we see something?
Yeah, I'm going to be doing several things on it. I'm not exactly sure. The one other important piece, if I could be honest, in this post-war period, one of the reasons we've not known what to do with the post-war period is because of the narrative we've had, the broader cultural narrative, that the church was always in decline. So particularly when we look at new church development, the narrative had become, going back to Reg Bibby in Fragmented Gods, and I think it's 85, we were building these churches while everything was going down. So should we have done that? And so it really became important to try to establish really what was going on with religion in Canada. And I think, shameless self-promotion, that's why Brian Clark and I wrote the book we did on leaving Christianity, which is looking at the demographics, and we argue quite a different picture. So yeah, that's an important thing to lay the foundation of, and then understand. The post-war period, the first part of it was a deeply religious period, and that shifts our understanding. But the fact that we can now talk about that, and we have the statistics to back it up, now we can go back and look at all the other things that was happening. The one thing that's happening, we all note, is the building of new churches, but we also forget the closing down of churches in some of the main cities, the hollowing out of the West End Presbyterian churches. I didn't even know there was a Chalmers Presbyterian church in Toronto. I don't know why I didn't know that, but I didn't. I think that's where my grandparents were married. But I've only found that out since then. But in this period, it had a couple of hundred members, if not more. And so computer maps allow us to look at that change. And I didn't even see it until I mapped it. So the technology can really be helpful. Kim and then.
Towards that technology, I'm wondering that maybe part of our problem was, and this actually comes from directly from Bibby, that we had churches we were trying to keep open where the people weren't, and we didn't have churches where the people were.
Yes. So we did something right. You should always applaud yourself when you did something right. So we had a wonderful person who used to work here by the name of Ann Miller, who was willing to take all of the data on all of the congregations in the Presbyterian Church in Canada and put them in spreadsheets. We have that information. And one of the things we did right was we chose our years carefully. So we chose to go, this is going to take, we didn't go 1950, 1955. We did 1951, 1956, because on the ones is where the census is. So we should be able at some point to relate that to the census data. And Gord, your point is right, we're anticipating that. And I'm interested in that as much in terms of rural depopulation as anything else. But we actually did that one right. And Anne was so great, 'cause she said she talked to me and we planned that. But she did the work, and I'm just really grateful. But if you want to do anything on that, all of that information is available. And it's available, I think, from 1875. Like, it's incredible information that's available in these sheets. I couldn't have done the computer mapping without it. I do some changes, I clearly have to, because a computer map would just go nuts with all the data in it. But yeah, so that's great. Kim had a point, and then we probably should break for lunch.
Hello. I work in the church archives, and of course, a big part of what we do is we maintain and manage the records for legal purposes for the Presbyterian Church in Canada, so the records management side of things. But the other side of it is for historical research and just general information. And I just wanted to, stress that we also have been concerned that history departments have been shrinking over the years, those enrolled in them, that certainly the work in church history has declined, and it's been a big concern. We don't necessarily have as many of the sort of fathers of church history, if I could put it that way. I should say fathers and mothers, but church history to really promote this among our people and the schools and the churches and at all ages. And so we've noticed that decline. So I bemoan that. That makes me sad. But all is not lost. I think conversations like this are very positive, very encouraging. I think we need to do more of it, have more round tables, at different levels of the church, whether it's at presbytery or really take it out to the church, and make this something that's a lot more lively. Mm-hmm. So I would like to see that. I just want to say, trust me, I go around saying I hear voices in the stacks all the time, and people, say, "Are you going squirrely after all these years?" But I don't mean it in that way. I mean that, within each page that we store in the archives, there are voices that have something to say, voices that served our God, voices that were committed, and it's not just for the church, but rather because the context is within our society, it touches all elements of our society. It's relevant to everyone. Yeah. And that's something that I think gets overlooked. Where we pick up with researchers these days are researchers maybe not doing so much the core historical work, such as Bob and Richie did today, where it's, quite very much purely Presbyterian, the works of men and women, but rather the contextual history is so important. And I think now where we're picking up more researchers are people that are coming to study the role of the church, but where they've been one of many. So say, for example, people working with NGOs, where they're studying many organizations, but they're coming to us from the Presbyterian perspective. So we still, have a high researcher number for sure, but I see it a little bit drifting away from the core that we tend to enjoy here. So it's all good, but I just thought I'd share a few thoughts there.
Thank you very much, and that's really helpful. I know we need to go to lunch, but I'm just going to say that I think that's a really good note to end on. There's people who are still interested, but they might be coming at it in different ways. And so again, as a society, what we might find is we're doing a few more comparative papers, Presbyterian and something else. There's a young lady out in the prairies who's looking at the way various denominations handled residential schools and issues like that. And there's nothing wrong with that. So it's just us. So I hope that this has opened up a conversation. So thank you very much. I'm switching hats, and I'm going to turn it over to Ian. We have our lunch from 11:45 to 1:30. I've mentioned where washrooms are. There's the display. There are some books for sale as well back there. Some are free and some are for sale, and nobody has a tag on them. So let me tell you, the Brian Fraser books, History of the College of Knox College, if you don't have a copy, it's free. The Green Book on diaconal ministers is free. Brian Clark and my book, $25 to me, if you're interested. And the other book is Don McLeod's and Ian.
Yes, that's Don McLeod's, and Sid Castle brought that in. Sid is our treasurer, sitting in the back corner, and that is, I believe, $20, and that is the China Mish Kid book that Don wrote last year. As well, we have copies from past years of the Canadian Society of History papers. So if you don't have a past year paper, it is $15, also payable to Sid. And just one other comment, there is somebody that will arrive at noon, and she's going to be selling a book as well, and that is Mary Harvey from St. Andrew's Church in Brampton. She is related, as are several of us, to the Reverend Dr. Alec Bissett Mackay, formerly of the Crescent Street Presbyterian Church in Montreal, and he established a summer community in Capalago, Quebec. My French pronunciation is probably terrible, but he established a summer community resort, and so that book is about that family, and that's $25, and you'll be able to see Mary in about 10 minutes.
We're going to call everyone back to order. We just have finished our meeting, and we're moving into the afternoon part of the program. We have 3 papers, and we're going to move right into the first one. The paper is called An Analysis of the Role of the Church in Swan Lake First Manitoba, 1898 to 1998. And our presenter is the Reverend Leslie Elizabeth King, and we're glad to have her with us. She was ordained in 1980 by the United Church of Canada Hamilton Conference, settled at the Grand River Pastoral Charge, the Six Nations Reserve, and the new credit of the Mississaugas Reserve. She then served in Dundalk and then went out and served from 86 to 95 at the Swan Lake as the Swan Lake Outreach Minister. And I'll let her speak of other things. She's recently retired, but previous to ministry, she's worked in archaeology and various kinds of administration. And so we really look forward to your paper.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. Thank you for this opportunity to share something of the role of the church in Swan Lake First Nation, and I'll be focusing on the first part of the mission there, the Presbyterian years, from 1898 to 1925, but I push it a bit to 27. Swan Lake is an Anishinaabe community an hour's drive southwest of Winnipeg. It was on the map you had up on the wall a while ago, on the shores of a small lake of the same name. It has variously been called Yellow Quills Reserve after the chief who negotiated Treaty Number 1 in 1871 and fought hard to have good agricultural land reserved for his people, and it is top quality land. It has also been called Indian Springs for the natural spring there, and this part of the reserve had a post office, a CNR siding with a few staff houses. There is a village 5 miles east, also called Swan Lake. The information that is missing from much of this 100-year history, 30 as Presbyterian, 70 as United Church, is the conversation about the church and Christianity that went on within the Indigenous community, as well as the background to cryptic statements in church and government reports, such as why no babies survived for several years in a row. Was it the starvation caused by government withholding rations to pressure land surrender or to have families send their children to residential school? Was it smallpox, which was in the community in 1906? And how often did that return? How did that affect the ministry? How did Christian doctrine affect those whose children died? The work of the church needs to be understood within a wide social dynamic and recognize that the Swan Lake people were not passive recipients of what was happening to them. Every human being responds to the happenings around them in a variety of ways. A simple descriptive analysis of the role of the church is of limited value for the church today. Inference is needed, but must be exercised cautiously while we try to use this history to assist us as we live in a rapidly changing, pluralistic world. Primarily, this research and my writing is an act of reconciliation, acknowledging the reality of the lives of real people. Where is this? I'm puffing a bit. Jesus said, "Love one another as I have loved you." The United Nations says that intentionally destroying a language, a religion, and removing children from their families, community, and culture is genocide. Jesus said that he came to save the lost people of Israel, and the woman whose child was possessed said that even dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. The Acts and Proceedings of the Presbyterian Church for Canada for 1908 states, when the Dominion of Canada was extended westward, no one could think for a moment of leaving half a continent in the possession of a race incapable of extracting from it more than the merest pittance of its wealth. Our race took from an Indian, as if there was only one of them, that which is enriching us. We destroyed his living. Were we not bound to help him to regain what he had lost? Does not that same bond hold us to our task still? It is vain to say that he belongs to a race of weaklings and ought therefore to be allowed to sink to ever lower depths till he vanish from the earth. Are we not here to help him to become strong? Equally vain is it to plead that all our means and more are required for the stronger races, and therefore this weak one should be left alone to perish. Rather, is not this the little one, the weak one, for whom we must care for the sake of him who pitied our weakness and bore it, that we might become strong? That same year, in her annual report, the missionary teacher, Miss McIlwain, stated, remember this is 1908, the government has discovered the number of Indians the schools have killed. Let them find out the number killed by whiskey. I like that woman. Jesus said, I have come that they may have life abundantly, and blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. There is hope for our churches striving for righteousness, which failed to hear the voices of people who became possessions. And there is hope for the possessed. Just as Jesus did, we all operate out of our cultural identity, and just as Jesus did when we hear and learn from people we encounter, we can and have changed what we do. This history illustrates that process. The relationship of Swan Lake Band to the church began long before the Presbyterian mission was established. It is 1/3 of the original Portage Band, which was centered around Portage La Prairie, today 1 hour drive north of Swan Lake. In the 1850s, Anglican Archdeacon William Cochrane brought a group of settlers there to Anishinaabe traditional territory. He knew Yellow Quill and his people and ministered to them. Their situation was getting more desperate as the disruption of being colonized became more intense. The band's effort to limit land speculation was assisted by John Garrick, an Anglican lay reader who wrote out their letter to the settlers asking them to refrain from selling land until the treaty was completed. This was posted on the church door and published in the Manitoban. He was uncle to the second missionary teacher, Kemper Garrick. On the 22nd of September, 1898, Reverend R.P. McKay wrote to Mrs. Jeffrey, Secretary for Indian Work of the Women's Foreign Missionary Society, informing her that it was agreed to begin work amongst the 3 bands of Soto Indians when the Baptist Association signifies in writing that they have abandoned the field. It seems they have been laboring in one of the bands. In the following 100 years, the mission was served by 30 missionary teachers, matrons, students, ordained ministers, a diaconal minister, and by unnamed teachers who also acted as lay supply. They were Presbyterian, Anglican, Mennonite, and United Church of Canada. There were blocks of time when there was no minister. The church was always present with the permission of Swan Lake Band, with 2 exceptions. Sorry, Father, the Roman Catholic Church was not allowed to use the building that they put up without permission, and the occasional fundamentalist evangelical preacher was asked to leave. Robert McKay was appointed the 1st of June, 1898, as the first missionary teacher because he spoke Cree, son of the long-standing missionary at Mistawassus. Yellow Quill's people spoke Ojibwe. Robert left after 18 months. The Anglican lay reader, Kemper M. Garrick, who had likely known Yellow Quill in Portage La Prairie, where he grew up, was the second missionary teacher. He was a fiercely independent son of Métis free traders. When the Christian businesses in Swan Lake town would not advance credit to Swan Lake Band members for traps and hunting supplies, Garrick did. It was all repaid, but was part of why he was removed, that and his deep and debilitating grief when his wife died. He was there for nearly 6 years, and when he left, he didn't go far, but he moved to Indian Springs and lived there at least sometime into 1910. He appears to have had a good relationship with the fourth missionary teacher, Miss McIlwain, who I mentioned, and with the town, where he interpreted for at least one court case and served on the jury. The third missionary was Mrs. Kate Cameron, who came from Alberni and stayed only 8 months. The housing was not acceptable to her. Her first home visit was to a family with smallpox, and she didn't know that they were ill. Miss McIlwain, the fourth missionary teacher, had taught at the Regina Industrial School and was described in the Swan Lake Echo as a pleasant and forceful speaker. And I think I have found a picture of her, and we have a picture of what a miss looks like, but she was a miss. Don't cross that lady. She was joined for 1.5 years by a graduate, Miss Maggie Cote. They had an easier time than Kemper had. More children came to the day school, and up to 9 of them lived in the mission house that had finally replaced the loft that Kemper's family of 9 had lived in. And that was, this mission house was the new one that Mrs. Cameron did not approve of. Instead of helping local economic development, they did a lot of public speaking and brought groups to Swan Lake for programs. The newspaper described Miss Cote as an educated Indian maiden. They were either maidens or squaws, and one was good and one was not. It was very stereotyped, just like the Victorians in England stereotyped women. The paper described her as a fine singer, and during their time there, more students went to the Regina Industrial School. Now, Miss McIlwain did take on the liquor trade. She had seen too many children drunk, too many adults injured and dead. After the trial of a Mrs. Moclan from Somerset for selling essence of lemon, which was really wood alcohol, Miss McIlwain was so ill she had to take time off. When she came back to work, she accused the farm instructor, Malcolm Campbell, of selling liquor. This was a pattern seen by other missions, too. The conflict went on for a number of years after she left to become lady superintendent and secretary at Ninette Sanitarium in Manitoba. Miss Cote went to Crow Stand as an instructress. They were followed in 1919 by the sisters Jenny and Tina Bruce, who continued in much the same manner. Like McIlwain and Cote, they held Sunday worship in the school. Christian education work continued using picture rolls that the children could explain to their parents. Prayers assigned by the federal government were used in the school. WFMS groups had them as speakers and visited Swan Lake. Sewing and needlework were taught. They do not seem to have rocked any boats, and according to the Swan Lake Echo, were well liked by the people of Swan Lake, Indian Springs, and town. In October 1919, they retired to their brother's place in Lethbridge, Alberta. The Reverend James Donaghy and his wife came in April 1920. He was the first ordained missionary teacher, and his wife was the matron. She looked after noonday meals for the students, among other things. Donaghy spent a lot of his energy raising funds through Presbyterian congregations in Ontario, as well as trying to get more government money for the school and its programs. He actively interfered with traditional ceremonies by scheduling dinners, baseball games, or music when he knew they were on. He used magic tricks to discount what he called the magic tricks of the Roman Catholic priests and traditional Anishinaabe spiritual elders. In the school, he gave special rewards to the children he called the better class, thus dividing the community. After church union, Swan Lake, which became a United Church of Canada mission, was left off the list of missions to receive bales. Donaghy was furious, and he wrote pleading letters to church groups in Ontario describing the lives of Swan Lake band members in racist, dismissive ways, especially those he called the useless women who were far too independent for him. He did acknowledge that if the Indigenous concept of Manitou was not so like the Christian concept of God, it would be easier to convert them. The Donaghys left in 1927, and the Presbyterian portion of this mission ended. During the Presbyterian years, Miss McIlwain attended a conference in Winnipeg preparatory for the Layman's Missionary Movement Congress here in Toronto in 1909. She, Jenny Pruce, and James Donaghy were part of the Association of Presbyterian Workers among the Indians of the Synods of Manitoba and Saskatchewan. That's the title of the organization. During these years, there was a successful campaign by local settler communities to have all parts or all of the reserves sold off to what they called real settlers. A petition for this was sent to Ottawa in 1903. The newspaper publisher promoted it for years with racist, misleading, and anxiety-producing articles reprinted from other papers, plus speeches from Hansard. When he left the paper, he went into real estate. The Methodist missionary from Alberta, the Reverend John McDougall, was appointed by the federal government to negotiate a surrender of much of the reserve in 1907. He had written to the papers about the rights of Indigenous people to hold their traditional ceremonies in a modified form. And Yellow Quill understood him to say that after the land was surrendered, they would be able to hold a sundance. The government would not allow it and did not pay for the land as agreed. Yellow Quill and his council wrote to the Governor General of Canada in 1909 requesting payment. He said that they believed a minister would always tell the truth, which was why they signed. Mr. Frank Oliver, I guess the Honorable Frank Oliver, was the federal minister of the Interior at the time, responsible for the Indians and their lands, and he was an active Presbyterian during those years. Oliver wasn't the only Presbyterian who had exercised a lot of power over Indigenous people and Swan Lake specifically. David Laird was possibly the most influential. After he studied for ordination as a Presbyterian minister and chose not to, instead established a newspaper, Presbyterian paper in Prince Edward Island, and then went on into politics, he served as Minister of the Interior, as Superintendent of Indian Affairs, responsible for the Indian Act of 1876, and we are still dealing with the consequences of that in our country today. He had studied to become an ordained minister. I said that already. He was a member of the Foreign Mission Committee and on a church committee to formulate views respecting educational work among the Indians in the Northwest to be brought before the government in Ottawa. This resulted in the industrial schools that became the residential school system. He also served on the Winnipeg Presbytery Protection of Church Property Committee when he was Indian Commissioner for Manitoba and the Northwest. On the local level, the Inspector of Indian Agencies, Manitoba Superintendency, S.R. Marlett, was a member of the Presbyterian congregation in Portage la Prairie, and through his minister participated in the process that had Kemper Garrick removed as missionary teacher by the denomination. The church tied itself to the federal government for the authority to establish missions and run schools, providing access to the children who were more easily converted spiritually and culturally than their parents were. The church became dependent on government money and so obliged to follow the government agenda, even when it disagreed. And those disagreements rose and fell over the course of the years and continued on into United Church years. In the early years of the Swan Lake Mission, the church supported the development of Indigenous leadership and languages. It was easier to convert people using their own language, and it lessened concerns about inaccurate interpretation. But the government forbid the use of Indigenous languages in the schools. The government even refused permission for the church's Indigenous preachers to leave their own reserves to preach elsewhere after an earlier successful series of preaching rallies. It is easy, speaking like this, to emotionally separate church from government, but this would be a mistake. It has been my experience in Indigenous communities from the Haudenosaunee and Delaware, Mississauga, Anishinaabe, Cree, Dene, Sioux, and Haida that their understanding of church and state is not dualistic, and the actions of people identified as Christian are viewed as what Christianity is and what the church itself does. I have found no historical record that indicates otherwise, although absence of evidence is not proof. The point is that there was no separation between church and state or church and society in the perception of the indigenous people from the very beginning of this mission. In all, the Swan Lake Mission, variously named, functioned for 100 years, and ending in 1989 when continuing funding could not be arranged. What are we to make of these 100 years? The generations of Swan Lake Band members successfully resisted the organizational efforts of the Presbyterian Church in Canada and the United Church in Canada. Traditional ceremonies have always been conducted in the community, although often in secret or modified form. Janet Silman, 1978 to 81, Karen Douglas, 83 to 86, and I were invited to observe and sometimes to participate in sweats or the sun dance. Wakes, funerals, healing services, and weddings often combine traditional and Christian practices, funerals especially. Christianity itself as a faith, a relationship of trust with God as described in Christian teachings, had been converted into a form of spirituality that is more fitted to Anishinaabe culture. I see two reasons for this. One is the result of personal relationships between individuals in which mutual trust and respect were built and spiritual lives were shared. The more important reason, I think, is the use the band and its members made of the resources of the church. The church was an organization that was sometimes willing to use some of its power to provide what the people needed when they needed more power than they had on their own. It was not an easy relationship nor an easy journey. Yellow Quill and his community faced crushing, overwhelming changes to their lives. Eventually, there was no part of their lives as individuals and community that was not systematically attacked. And the church was a central part of that, sadly. The people resisted with what today would be called non-compliance, but they also resisted by selectively taking what they could use in order to survive, and the church provided some of that. The price the people paid should never have been required and should never be required again. The price is described in the United Nations definition of genocide: destruction of language, religion, and the forcible removal of children, among other things. From the point of view of the goal of the church to convert people to Christianity and develop a growing congregation with weekly worship services and church programs, as described in that association in the Synods of minutes, these 100 years were almost a complete failure. But Jesus didn't ask us to establish a hierarchical organization that controlled the lives of people. Jesus invited people into a deep personal relationship with God, our Creator, that would be expressed in every aspect of our lives, and to walk with others in that same relationship. No matter who we are, that is a lifelong process. Instead of controlling people, Jesus told his followers they were to serve people who tried to live this way. In the 1970s, the mission was redefined as an outreach ministry, and then in 83 as a ministry of presence. And it became something that was closer to what Jesus called for. I would like to say that despite itself, the church successfully served Swan Lake people in the way Jesus called it to, as a servant. But I'm not sure that is true except from time to time. What I do know is true is that the people of Swan Lake Reserve, along with every other Indigenous community that interacted with the churches in Canada, changed the churches in a way that has made us more faithful to the life Jesus called them to live. Thank you. And do you have questions? How much time do we have for questions? 10 minutes. Ooh, good.
There's a different philosophy. And that's all I need to say about it.
Well, yes. Yeah, times have changed. I mean, there's 100 years between now and when it started. And I know that there are strong visceral reactions to the use of the word genocide. And I think it's because of the way we define things when we give them a name. For example, another topic. Last night, I had my first ever Korean meal. I don't have a clue what it was. I don't have a name for it, but it's still what it was. Things don't come into existence, as in Genesis, I mean, God does that. Things don't come into existence when we name them. Genocide existed a long time before it was ever named officially. And has taken many different forms. But it always results in the exportation of something that existed before. And I know this is challenging. When I finished writing this, and actually this is only part of it, I've got a big bag full of stuff. I got a feeling that was really uncomfortable, that said, now I'm going to have to completely rethink how I have thought of Canadian history and of the role of the church in Canada. And that's very personal because my paternal grandparents went to Newfoundland in 1920 as missionaries. They had gone from England to Scotland. So, you know, this is personal for us when we really think about it. There's the microphone.
Sorry. Nope, you're fine, and I'll get back to you.
I confess that I don't really know a great deal about the history of mission to Aboriginal people, but I was intrigued when you said that at various times, at least sometimes, yeah, I think so, yeah. Although in the mind of the Indigenous folk, the church was identified with the government of the state.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
But at various times, the church mission or church representatives were critical of the government. So
yeah.
I'm just intrigued by that, but that wasn't noted by the Indigenous folk.
Yes, it was. I think that's one reason why there was a continuing relationship for 100 years. And actually, it's one reason why the Chief and Council in 1993, I'm not very quick, asked me to look at this history. And their criticism of the government changed according to the shifting agendas of the church. Government was fairly consistent. These people are sitting on land that has resources we want to extract from it. We have to remove the people. The church's agenda shifted. And I will say that all of the people who served this mission were committed to serving the church. Sometimes it was the church they served, not the people. Sometimes it was Christianity they served, neither and not the church, because the two aren't necessarily the same. But it's hard to do it justice in 9 pages. Yes.
One of the things I really appreciated was your focus on the agency of the Indigenous people themselves. Because so often when we think about residential schools, we end up with a conversation about how white people responded to each other. And so I think that's just a really important thing for us to think about, is how do people have agency and negotiate with it, and what's their perspective. I think I'm going to go away thinking more about the fact that we were probably always proud of when we distanced ourselves from the government, but in the eyes of others, we were still part of that. And that's actually probably a better insight than we realize. We always like to see ourselves as separate from the government in this period, and yet often the church's policies and the state's policies were very aligned. It was subtle differences that those outside that close circle would miss.
But in the very earliest years, there was no division. Alexander Morris, David Laird, Oliver, they were active in church structures, making decisions in government and in the church that affected the lives of people. There was no difference.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know what to do with this. Okay.
We're going to get Dave up now. One thing I neglected to say in the annual meeting, and I'm going to say it now as thank you while we're changing microphones and everything, is our coffee and our tea and our raisin bread and other treats were provided by Marilyn. So I want to just say we should all thank Marilyn for this. So thank Marilyn Repchak. We're going to continue in a similar theme. And so Dave Lee is now going to present Apology in the Making. Dave is a senior student here at Knox College in the MDiv program. And I'm always terrified to look at a student and say, you just have a few courses left, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's just near the end. This is a really interesting paper, as well as the previous was, so I'm going to turn it over to Dave.
Okay, thank you. So I find it rather timely and special to give this presentation on Presbyterian confession on its 25th anniversary. My understanding is that it's not always the case for students like Ann and myself who will be presenting today to present their papers at the conference. So I'd like to thank Dr. McDonald for this opportunity today. Writing of this paper began from a place of simple curiosity. I knew that I wanted to write about the Presbyterian Church in Canada's involvement with residential schools, as it was still a fairly new topic for me at the time. But the challenge lay in narrowing down to a specific topic. And then in my preliminary research, I came across an article by the Reverend Peter Bush, in which he focused on the apologies of the churches that were directly involved with residential schools. It was a 2015 paper. And one thing stuck out to me like a sore thumb. I noticed that the Presbyterian Church in Canada was the last of the 4 denominations to offer its apology, with the others being the United Church in 1986, the Missionary Oblates in 1991, and the Anglican Church of Canada in 1993. It took nearly 8 years since the United Church's apology for the Presbyterian Church to offer theirs. So I wondered, what took us so long? What was the church doing during this time? Because I would look at resources and it would just say that the first draft was presented in 1992 and then it was adopted in 1994. So there weren't that many sources that told the stories in between. So I was wondering what was going on during this time. And this question became the genesis of my subsequent research and writing. So in this paper, I will demonstrate how the 1994 confession by the Presbyterian Church in Canada was indeed the product of a lengthy and complex process, a process which was characterized by the lack of denominational awareness of the residential school legacy, by an external political pressure, and by the desire to be truthful, fair, and well-informed. So I'll specifically look at the events from the year of 1986 to the presentation of the confession in 1994. So we're working within a very specific scope and a time frame. And a closer look at these events during these years, both in and outside the denomination, will reveal an internal turmoil which the church had experienced as it was trying to fully comprehend its involvement with the Indigenous people of Canada. On August 14, 1986, the Reverend Bob Smith, who was the moderator of the General Council of the United Church of Canada, issued an apology on the denomination's behalf. The apology was delivered before a group of Indigenous elders who were part of the church and yet still wanted to have their voices heard. Reverend Smith apologized for the ways in which the church, I quote, confused the Western ways and culture with the expansiveness of the gospel and helped destroy what was at the heart of the Indigenous life and culture. The influence of this important event on the Presbyterian Church in Canada was evident because within the following year, an overture was filed at the 113th General Assembly by Richard E. Sand, who was the clerk of Synod of Manitoba and Northwestern Ontario. The overture urged the Presbyterian Church to recognize the bold steps taken by the United Church and respond to the requests of Indigenous peoples to, quote, to move beyond the structures and practices of the past. Further, it pushed for an undertaking of new ecumenical discussions with the native reserves on which the ministers had worked. The Assembly recommended that the overture be sent to the Board of World Mission and have what was then called the Native Ministry of Canada's Operations Committee report back at the next year's Assembly. However, the report on Native Ministries took nearly 2 years to finish and was presented at the 1989 General Assembly. It noted that the existing structures of the church undermined the growth of Native leadership and recognized the need for the church to embark on a new and different path. It suggested that a committee be specifically established for this purpose, with much representation coming from the presbyteries and synods closely involved with Native ministry, including Indigenous persons. Although this soon led to the formation of the National Committee on Native Ministry, there was still no visible sign from the denomination of issuing its apology to the Indigenous peoples. So what was this about? Was the church just hoping to quietly move on from the past by working diligently alongside Indigenous peoples in the present? Or was the church simply oblivious to the seriousness of their involvement in residential schools, seeing that they operated fewer numbers of schools than the other denominations? It wasn't until later that fall that the events which unfolded one after another began to reveal the inner thoughts and attitudes of the church. And these events took place between the year of 1989 and 1990. During the fall of 1989, CBC aired a film, Where the Spirit Lives, which told the story of a young Indigenous girl and her struggles of living in a residential schools in the 1930s. Then the summer of 1990 saw what's now known as the Oka Crisis, in which a violent land dispute between the First Nations and the police resulted in 2 deaths. And this particular incident was highly publicized and subsequently led to a greater exposure of Native issues. And further revelations were made on the residential school legacy. Lastly, in the fall of the same year, an interview between Chief Phil Fontaine of Manitoba and Barbara Frum was shown on CBC's The Journal, after Fontaine had shared his experiences of abuse to a group of Indigenous high school students. These 3 events forever changed the conversation of residential schools and shaped the context in which the other churches apologized. In 1991, the Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate issued their statement of apology on 2 separate occasions. The statement in which the Reverend Doug Crosby, who was the president of the Oblates Conference of Canada, had read, specifically apologized for the existence of the residential schools themselves, for the physical and sexual abuse that took place, and for the dismissal of Native religious tradition. It was the first time that the residential school legacy had been addressed in an apology, compared to its predecessor, which only addressed the issue of evangelization and cultural assimilation. Likewise, there was a growing awareness of the residential school legacy within the PCC during that same year. The church was already involved in allegations of abuse and neglect by the Indigenous peoples. So to gain a deeper insight and understanding of the issue, members from the National Head Office visited a reserve in Manitoba to hear the stories of the survivors. They included Reverend Ian Morrison, Reverend Dr. Ray Hodgson, who was the General Secretary of Church and Society at the time, and Miss June Stevenson, who was the editor of Glad Tidings. The representatives found the experience so revealing and shocking that in an interview with John Congram of the Presbyterian Record on November 6, 1991, so John asked, "What about an apology?" And June said, "I think we need more than an apology. We need confession." And Ray replied, "Yes, first to God, and then to those we have wronged. Then we need to tie it into specific actions." With these words began the process of drafting an apology that sought to be more than just an apology. It was a confession of sin, expressing the notion that all wrongdoing is ultimately a sin against God. In 1992, the 2.5-page confession was presented at the 118th General Assembly, titled Reconciliation with Aboriginal Peoples. However, the confession was not adopted for approval. It was instead referred to the Life and Mission Agency for a more balanced presentation of this church's mission and ministry to Native peoples, with the instruction that they listen to a broader spectrum of Aboriginal peoples, to former students of the residential schools. Overall, the 92 Assembly demonstrated a lack of awareness within the church. Many of the commissioners who were present at the Assembly were oblivious to the fact that the church had its own residential schools. They couldn't even point out on a map those 2 schools that the PCC had operated after 1925, which were Bertle Residential School in Manitoba and Cecilia Jeffrey Residential School in Kenora. And the divide at the Assembly was clear. On the one hand, there were those who spoke up and urged the church to own up to their wrongdoing. Some of them dissented to the motion to refer the confession. Then on the other hand, there were those who genuinely did not see the church as the source of blame and sought to do as much damage control as possible. And I highlight the Women's Missionary Society Western Division as an example. Because when the allegations of abuse concerning the Presbyterian residential schools first surfaced, the WMS received much of the finger-pointing and the blame. It was because from 1927 to 1969, the WMS had assumed full responsibilities of the schools that had been under the authority of Foreign Missions Committee previously. But the WMS was resistant to the accusations and made their positions clear in the 1992 issue of Glad Tidings. This was a quote taken from it. There was no pattern to go by. The church was confronted with an entirely new situation, and they did what seemed to be for the best at considerable expense and effort on their part. WMS felt that the positive results of the school system, like education and giving a voice for the indigenous peoples to speak up for themselves later on, had been entirely overlooked in favor of the allegations that rose at the time. In reality, there were those who saw what was being done at the time and tried to protest against the system, but they were only silenced and ignored. So the WMS pushed for fair distinctions to be made in the confession, which was acknowledged, and even attempted to prevent those who sought to get to the bottom of the issue. So this created a certain friction between the WMS and certain members of our denomination. An example of this is when Tamiko Corbett, who was then president of the WMS, forbid the Reverend Peter Bush, who was writing a paper on 2 schools at the time, from accessing the WMS records. And Peter wrote on his experience on this in the 2017 paper that he submitted for CSPH, titled Reflections on the 25 Years of Writing About Residential Schools. And even though a compromise was eventually reached between Bush and Corbett, such an incident served as an indication of the internal turmoil in the denomination during that time. So as a whole, the church was moving through a rocky terrain, balancing the need for education and apology to the indigenous peoples against the possible consequences of acknowledging their responsibility in the matter. In August of 1993, the Anglican Church of Canada gave their statement of apology. The Archbishop Michael Pierce spoke on the behalf of the church, pledging to walk with and alongside the indigenous peoples towards healing and reconciliation. However, the subdued response of the Aboriginal delegates at the event made it clear that they did not deem the apology as closing the book on the residential school legacy for good. Just a few months prior, the Life and Mission Agency reported to the 119th General Assembly that while the confession was still in the works, some progress indeed had been made. Representatives of the church, such as Hodgson and Florence Palmer, took concrete steps towards raising awareness of the residential school legacy and broadening their understanding of the issue at hand. Discussions of the schools continue to take place both in and outside the church, and the Presbyterian-based publications, such as the Presbyterian Record and Glad Tidings, published articles on the schools as well. And in 1994, the Presbyterian Confession to the Indigenous Peoples was finally presented at the General Assembly. The report given by the Justice Ministries was almost 3 times the length of the 1992 report. It not only covered the historical context, but also historical chronological overview, as well as personal testimonies. The evidence of the intensive research and work done on the subject was apparent. Overall, the final report proved to be more detailed and nuanced in its presentation and treatment of the residential school legacy. In comparison, the revised draft of the confession remained basically unchanged, with certain statements either edited or combined together. In line with its theological intent, the confession began with the words, "The Holy Spirit, speaking in and through Scripture, calls the Presbyterian Church in Canada to confession." The confession acknowledged the complicity of the church in the governmental policy of assimilation, as well as the residential school system, and asked forgiveness from God and the Indigenous peoples. So the Presbyterian Confession marked what was the quote, and what was the end of an evolution in the statements that began in 1986 with the United Church. It was a product of not only the desire of the church to set things right with those to whom the lasting harm had been done, but also of a period of study, reflection, and deliberation. And this time, the confession was adopted for approval by the Assembly, with recommendations to explore ways of bringing it to the Indigenous peoples. And on October 8, 1994, on behalf of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, Reverend George Weiss was the moderator of the Assembly that year, presented the confession to Chief Phil Fontaine at the Forks National Site in Winnipeg. Other members of the church present at the event were Tamiko Corbett, who was then Executive Secretary of the WMS, and June Stevenson. Kay Cowper, then president of the WMS, took the time to offer her words of apology. The occasion proved to be a historic and special one because compared to the events held by the other denominations, the PCC held a ceremony in an Aboriginal space than a church space, thereby making for a more public presentation of apology than the others. And even though Chief Fontaine made it clear that he was not ready to forgive the church yet, the event itself was an important first step in the healing and reconciliation journey between the PCC and the Indigenous peoples, which would later prove to be one that is paved with challenges and difficulties. So to conclude, the seeming lateness of the 1994 confession was a complex work of conflicting perspectives, intensive research, and intentional reflection on the Presbyterian Church's involvement with residential schools. Looking back, it could be said that to simply adopt and present the initial draft of the confession in 92 would have been rather premature, given the lack of awareness shown by the church at the time. This, however, is meant to suggest that those 2 years were all that the church needed to come to a sufficient understanding of things. If anything, the task of owning up to the truth of residential schools and living deeply into the confession proves to be challenging for the church well into the millennium. So it must be even said that even today, as we recognize its 25th anniversary, we, the church, ought not to treat the confession as simply something of the past, but that which must be spoken in new times and contexts. Also, that we can truly reaffirm our commitment to walking together with the Indigenous peoples now and into the future. Thank you. Clyde again.
Well, I wasn't going to say. I just wanted to say, a very, very well-written paper. I'm just so very. I'm teaching Dave's in one of my classes, so I didn't.
Which makes it.
So I'm looking forward to what you're going to do in my class. Thank you.
Ken.
I'm actually going to echo. I was bursting to say the same thing, actually. I work in the archives, and so I've studied this subject since 1998 when it first came to us, and I just want to commend you on how well you wove this together in such a, concise and yet very detailed way. That's a very hard job. So thank you so much for your paper.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Dave, you're making the argument that one of the reasons it took so long, and I know you go into why maybe it wasn't so long, but was a lack of awareness on the part of the PCC about the Aboriginals, the work with residential schools. I think that's true. I just think that is. I think people weren't really aware of it, and that's one of the things. I want to know if you want to comment on another thing, because you were suggesting this as you went along, is that this was a first step, but there was still not only a long way to go, but still some tensions. And it seems to me that one of the phrases within the confession that continues at the time, but still has raised concerns would be some of the phraseology around how evangelism was done, how we chose to share Jesus. So I just wanted to know if you wanted to comment a bit more on that, because I think it got through, but that in today may be the most challenging part of that confession for some Presbyterians.
That's very true. Yeah, evangelism definitely is. It was in the back of my mind, as especially as I was writing this paper, and it was a unique experience because, to be honest, I didn't know anything about what the residential school legacy was about until I entered seminary. It wasn't taught to me. I went through. I was in church throughout my high school years. And I went on a mission to the Native Reserve, but nothing was told to me about what this was about. So when I heard about, these things like blanket exercises and healing and reconciliation, I'm like, what's this about? So I think, and I realized it's how important it is to really educate and inform, especially the young people who are very kind of at distance with this, something like this. And so that it informs how they, their understanding of evangelism, especially as they prepare for such thing as, mission trips or to visit, native reserves, for instance. So at the place of ministry that I'm currently, which is St. Timothy Presbyterian Church, this past summer, one of our other ministers actually used this paper as a way to inform our college students who went on trips to the native reserves, one in Saskatchewan and the other in Manitoba. And it was an eye-opening experience to them because they are like, it's shifted their understanding of evangelism in a sense that we go there not to talk so much, but to listen. And I think that's an important posture to have, And I realized, it's a way to really continue this efforts of healing and reconciliation really has to begin, I believe, from the places of our ministry. And I think we have the responsibility of really informing and educating, especially the young people, of what this really is about and how and what it means to really spread and share the gospel, the good news with others. So.
We're going to move, actually we're not going to move in time much, but we're going to move in topic. Our last two papers have in different ways dealt with mission to Indigenous people. We're now going to shift and look at education. So it's a great pleasure to present our next presenter, who's Anne McGilvray, who is a MTS, Master of Theological student here at Knox College. But some of you will also know Anne in another capacity because she is a key player in our library here. She is the Technical Service Coordinator. If you're wondering what a Technical Service Coordinator is, she's the person who does all of the stuff we don't see, but that we can, so that we can find books. So she does all the cataloging, and she knows our collection really well. And this is just a really important role that she plays here. But this is a fascinating paper, I thought, and so I've encouraged her to share it with you, called Educating Baby Boomers, Sunday School Curriculum Recommendations in the Presbyterian Church in Canada, 1940 to 1970.
Thank you, Stuart. There we go. Okay. So as Stuart said, I'm going to be talking about curriculum between 1940 and 1970. When I started this topic, I knew nothing about curriculum, but as I studied it, I became fascinated by it. And this is just the first of about 4 papers I've done for my MTS studies involving curriculum. So choosing Sunday school curriculum isn't something that you think of as a particularly political activity. You imagine the person or the committee doing the choosing, surveying the possibilities and finding the best fit theologically and pedagogically for the situation. But when you remember the many people who have a stake in that choice, you begin to think of the political pitfalls associated with it. Students, their parents, Sunday school teachers, Sunday school superintendents, ministers, theologians of the church, and publishers all have varying needs and expectations to be fulfilled in the curriculum. From 1925 to about 2015, the Presbyterian Church in Canada made recommendations to the church at large and its congregations regarding Sunday school curriculum, and for many years even published that curriculum itself. The recommendations came from the Board of Sabbath Schools and Young People's Societies, which became the Board of Christian Education in 1952, which became part of the Board of Congregational Life in 1973. So I'm going to refer to all of them as the board hereafter. This paper will look at the recommendations made between about 1940 and 1970. This is broadly the time when the baby boom generation was attending Sunday school. From declining attendance in the 1930s and early 1940s, Sunday school attendance in Canada and in the Presbyterian Church went to all-time highs in the 1950s and 1960s. If the baby boom generation can be said to be those children born between about 1945 and 1965, they were the target audience for the curriculum decisions made starting early in the 1940s and going into the 1960s. It will be seen through an examination of the board reports and General Assembly minutes that while the committee was concerned to make wise pedagogical choices, they also faced influences from both inside and outside the denomination, which affected their choices. Factors such as the attitudes of the denomination to cooperation with other communions, the opinions of congregations regarding curriculum, the costs of producing curriculum, and the availability of resources for producing it, external events, and availability of outside curriculum all entered into the board's recommendations. The early 1940s found Canadians coming out of the Great Depression, but embroiled in the Second World War. For Presbyterians, the memory of the dispute over church union was recent. The continuing Presbyterians were a much smaller denomination, post-union than the pre-union Presbyterian Church in Canada, and their small size affected their ability to produce and publish their own materials. The Sunday school materials used before union went into the United Church of Canada, along with their publishing agency, and for the first few years after 1925, the continuing Presbyterians purchased materials from the publishing house of the Presbyterian Church in the USA, Westminster Press. Gradually, they began to edit those materials for a Canadian audience and then to publish their own materials. Reverend Norman A. McEachern was a key person in this process. He was the one to edit the Westminster materials and then to edit and write Presbyterian Church in Canada materials. In 1931, he became the publisher of those materials when he established Presbyterian Publications. In 1934, the General Assembly agreed to recognize Presbyterian Publications as the official publishing house for the church's Sunday school publications. Presbyterian Publications was an integral part of the Board of Sabbath Schools and Young People's Societies and later the Board of Christian Education. The editor was part of the board and was invited every year to address General Assembly during the presentation of the board's report to the Assembly. McEachern was highly commended in those reports, and he seems to have worked sacrificially in his editing and publication roles. By the 1940s, the curriculum situation was relatively stable. The main curriculum was based on the International Uniform Lesson Series, a scheme which worked for Sunday schools, a bit like the New Common Lectionary does today for scripture reading in the church. While the lesson series specified the content of the lessons, it appears that each denomination was free to edit or produce their own version of the lessons or lesson helps, and this is what Presbyterian Publications was doing into the 1940s. Annual reports of the board expressed satisfaction with this situation and urged Canadian Presbyterians to show their support for Presbyterian Publications by ordering their Sunday school supplies from that company. The 1942 General Assembly saw the first challenge to that equilibrium. The Assembly was presented with a motion to consider essentially producing their own curriculum. That a study of the possible advantage and greater benefit to the Sabbath schools and church through a syllabus of Bible studies prepared and issued by the Assembly's board be commended. The board took up this motion and did indeed do a study of curriculum over the next year. It is uncertain just what the church was looking for in seeking to produce its own curriculum. A syllabus of Bible studies was already being used in the International Uniform Lesson Series, was being adapted specifically for the Canadian Presbyterian audience, and was being published in Canada. At any rate, the board undertook a study of the matter over the next year and came back in 1943 with this reply: that having taken into account the whole field we seek to serve, we cannot see that we are in a position to produce any syllabus better than the one known as the International Lesson Series, and at the same time would intimate that if there is any syllabus known to anyone and held to be better, we are prepared to consider the same. It's likely that there were few good alternatives and that producing their own curriculum was deemed too costly. The 1943 Assembly accepted this reply. But the year following seems to have produced some new wrinkles. The General Assembly of 1944 was asked to consider a recommendation from the board, that the board be granted permission to explore the possibility of cooperation with other communions in the production of lesson material. A special committee was struck to consider the recommendation and came back with their response, which was that the board be granted immediate permission not just to explore the possibility, but to go ahead and cooperate with the other denominations. In the custom of General Assembly minutes, we're not given the substance of the debate that followed, but the outcome was that on the vote being taken, the motion was lost, and the board was not to be allowed to enter into the cooperative venture. Instead came this supplemental recommendation, moved by W.S. Reed and adopted, that the Board of Sabbath Schools and Young People's Societies be instructed to continue the publication of Sabbath school material for our church, and that the Board of Administration provide, if necessary, sufficient funds to enable the board to carry out this instruction. Why the denial of the original recommendation for cooperation? The cooperating denominations were not specified in the minutes, but they were the United Church of Canada and the Baptist Federation of Canada. The events of 1925 were still fairly fresh in the memory of many Canadian Presbyterians, And it may have been that they were still wary of any cooperation with other denominations, and especially the United Church of Canada. Whatever the nature of the discussion, the Assembly had committed the Church to the publication of its own curriculum, a decision they would live with for the next 20 years. Is there an irony in the fact that the same year the Presbyterian Church in Canada committed to producing their own curriculum, the Presbyterian Church in the USA recruited a Canadian Presbyterian to be the editor-in-chief of one of the most successful Sunday school curricula of the 20th century? James D. Smart, author of What a Man Can Believe, which had been published in 1943, and a minister in Peterborough, Ontario, moved to Philadelphia to take on this new venture of producing what was to become the Christian Faith and Life curriculum. Smart was strongly neo-Orthodox in his theology, something that he transmitted to the new curriculum. This new curriculum had been in the works since 1937, and it was finally published in 1948. It was immediately successful. It followed a 3-year cycle, emphasizing Jesus Christ the first year, the Bible the second year, and the church the third year. Besides the weekly lessons, reading books for older students and beautifully illustrated picture books for younger students were produced. Pictures used as visual aids were to be as historically accurate as possible, and writers and artists wrestled with presenting to children the difficulties of modern scriptural scholarship. Materials were also produced to train teachers and parents in child development and psychology. The result was a well-thought-out, good-quality curriculum. The 1948 release of the Christian Faith and Life curriculum nicely coincided with the beginning of the baby boom, as well as an increase in church and Sunday school attendance in North America. It was extremely well received. Meanwhile, back in Canada, the Presbyterian Church in Canada began producing its own new curriculum. This picture isn't what they were producing. It's the best I could do. While the Christian Faith and Life series took years to move from conception to production, the Canadian Church began to publish their new curriculum in 1945, just 1 year after they were mandated to do so. Admittedly, it was not much different from the International Uniform Lesson Series, which had come before. A 1945 leaflet about the new program described the Presbyterian Uniform Bible lessons as covering the New Testament and portions of the Old Testament over the course of 5 years. The lessons were for the junior department, grades 4 to 6, through the senior department, grades 9 to 12. There were no audiovisual resources supplied. For the younger children, the board continued to recommend the International Uniform Lesson Series in order that the classes of smaller children may make use of the colored picture roll and colored lesson cards available for this course. The production of the new curriculum was not without trouble. Norman McEachran became sick and died in July 1945. His editorial duties were turned over to Neil Smith, a young minister who remained editor until 1953. Smith reported to the General Assembly in 1948 on the serious difficulties in financing the cost of printing the PCC publications. The paragraph included, "The action of the board in reducing the amount available for the purpose of producing all of our own materials forced the board to agree to cooperation in the production of our illustrated papers. We shall continue to produce our own lesson helps as we have hitherto done." Again, the General Assembly Acts and Proceedings do not record any discussion of the above statement. What was not stated in the report was the identity of the denominations with whom the board was cooperating: the United Church of Canada and the Baptists, with whom they had wanted to cooperate in 1944. The board did not ask permission in the form of a recommendation, and the report was accepted by the General Assembly. The outcry against this move began very soon. The September after that General Assembly, the Presbytery of Brandon submitted an overture saying that the move had been made without the consent of the church, and that the teaching in these papers has been found to be inconsistent with the scriptures, beliefs, and standards of our church. The Synod of Saskatchewan issued a similar overture. The board was forced to back down. It was not lost on Canadian Presbyterians that important things were happening with curriculum in the United States. Many would have been aware that one of their own people was the editor-in-chief of the new Christian Faith and Life series. Overtures requesting the board to consider recommending the Christian Faith and Life series began as early as 1948, the year it came out. The board established a curriculum committee in 1949, which studied curricula from all over the church, but in the end agreed that our own Presbyterian lesson helps should be used in our Sunday schools and announced a new 6-year cycle of those lessons. James Smart returned to Canada in 1950 as minister of Rosedale Presbyterian Church in Toronto. In addition to his pastoral duties, he was recruited to be on the board of Sabbath schools and young people's societies. He did not become the editor of the PCC curriculum, but it is likely that he would have had a huge influence on the decisions of the board and would have been able to mentor the new editor, given his experience with the Christian Faith and Life curriculum. Big things were happening in curriculum in the 1950s in the wider world, possibly encouraged by the success of Christian Faith and Life and by the full churches and Sunday schools of the time. Almost every major denomination in the United States and Canada was working on its own new curriculum. Major changes came in the Presbyterian Uniform Lessons curriculum as well. In 1953, the board announced that a new 6-year cycle had been prepared with 3 major themes: the life and teaching of Jesus Christ, the Bible, and the church. One cannot think that it is an accident that these are the same themes that were used in the Christian Faith and Life curriculum. There appears to have been much more thought and work poured into this new curriculum than the one developed in 1944 and 1945. Work on this curriculum was begun 3 years before its introduction in 1955, and 2-day conferences for lesson writers were held at least twice. The prospectus listed the reading books of the Christian Faith and Life series as part of the supplies that could be ordered. The response to the new curriculum was very positive, as demonstrated by the immediate increase in sales. 1953 brought a change in curriculum for the younger children as well. The homegrown Presbyterian Uniform Lesson Series was written for the junior through senior departments, about ages 9 through 16. The Board of Christian Education recognized that the younger children needed a more closely graded curriculum and recommended the Canadian Graded Bible Lessons for children ages 3 through 8. Interestingly, the board said in their report that these lessons were prepared for our church in cooperation with the Baptists and the United Church. That is, the same cooperation that had been resisted by the church in 1944 and 1948. Assembly minutes do not record that the board had asked permission for this cooperation, nor do they record any opposition. Perhaps 5 years had made some forget their reluctance to cooperate, or people were getting tired of the International Lesson Series. It may also have helped that the board recommended the Christian Faith and Life series as an alternative to the Canadian Graded Bible Lessons for the younger children, although only a small percentage of Sunday schools used Christian Faith and Life. With a new curriculum for older church school students in the Presbyterian Uniform Lesson Series, and 2 options for the younger students in the Canadian Graded Bible Lessons and the Christian Faith and Life series, the curriculum situation was relatively stable for about 5 years. In 1959, though, the board began to anticipate the need for change. The Canadian Graded Bible Lessons for the younger children would be discontinued in 1964 when the United Church planned to bring out its own new curriculum. The PCC had to come up with a new plan. And as they reviewed the situation, they realized that they did not have the resources to produce a curriculum that would compete with the new sophisticated curricula of larger denominations. They decided to finally recommend the Christian Faith and Life curriculum for all ages except for the adult classes. This in itself required a lot of preparation and training to ready everyone for its introduction in 1964. The trouble was, Christian Faith and Life was now 16 years old and at the end of its life cycle. The American Presbyterians were starting to plan its successor, Christian Faith in Action. The Presbyterian Church in Canada participated in the development of the new curriculum, but it was now the 1960s and the scene had changed. There were many more viable options for Sunday school curriculum both in Canada and the United States. Attitudes towards religion were changing, and attendance at church and Sunday school was beginning to decline. Despite the continued calls through the years for Christian faith and life to be the recommended curriculum for the whole Sunday school, not everyone was happy. Some found Christian faith and life difficult to teach. Other churches were not large enough to support a closely graded curriculum. In 1967, the board recommended the new Covenant Life curriculum as an alternative to Christian faith and life. In 1968, it recommended alternatives to those closely graded curricula, the broadly graded Covenant Life curriculum and the Uniform Lessons Cooperative Series. Perhaps tired of wrangling over the curriculum, the Board of Christian Education introduced in 1968 the principle of responsible congregational selection of curriculum for adults and teens. Congregations were free to choose their own curriculum, with guidance given from the Board of Christian Education through a list of suggested options. Without the financial investment in producing its own curriculum, the board could afford to allow churches greater latitude in selection, and even listed the benefits in its reports, such as choosing the curriculum according to local needs or current issues, and using local talents and resources in Christian education. The story I've just told shows the many elements held in tension in the recommendations for a curriculum for Presbyterian Church in Canada congregations. Certainly, the chief concern for the Board of Sabbath Schools and Young People's Societies, and subsequently the Board of Christian Education, was to provide good quality, theological sound curriculum for the church. But the board served at the pleasure of the church, and so its recommendations were affected by the opinions and decisions of that church. The board also had to work with available resources, whether in finances, personnel, or the availability of other curricula. And finally, the board had to deal with external agencies and events, such as opportunities for cooperation in publishing and changing theologies and culture. That's it. Questions?
Just a question from me. In your research, did you come across anything about the Friendship Press and their resources? Because I know that was used in the United Church of Canada, so I don't know if that was used as a curriculum, and it may be out of the range of your period of study too. It may have been in the 1970s.
I think it was later than the range. I think we have some of that in our curriculum collection.
Okay.
Was that for handicapped children?
I think that was produced in New York. It seems to me that it was
okay.
New York City.
Yeah, I don't know it very well.
Okay.
So.
I'm old enough to have taught the Christian faith and life at Glenview, and we found it was wonderful for the younger children because of the illustrated materials that they took home.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I thought was not a good thing, I grew up in the generation where you memorized scripture and you had your authorization from the Board of Sabbath School and Young People's Society, and so on. And I think that was neglected in the Christian faith and life. You had to understand things before you could memorize them. A lot of things in the Bible I didn't understand growing up, but as I went into ministry, this was tremendously helpful that I had memorized scripture.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was one of the downfalls of the Christian faith and life.
Yeah, I know the PCC had a program, and I think it was through the PCC of memorizing scripture and giving out certificates or something like that.
That was kind of dropped along the way.
I think it was, yeah.
The museum,
Thank you.
The museum has some of those certificates, the National Presbyterian Museum. And you were encouraged to know the Westminster Confession of Faith, the shorter catechism, the longer catechism, and you would receive, upon completion, you would have a certificate signed by the Sunday school superintendent of your congregation, the minister of the church, and the moderator of the Presbyterian Church in Canada would sign that certificate.
I've spoken to every other speaker, so why not this one? Unless I dozed off for a moment, you didn't mention, or I don't think you mentioned, the reaction of the Presbyterian Church in the late 60s to the new curriculum of the United Church.
You know, I could not find any documentation about their reaction in reports or anything. And I know, I was looking for it. But I couldn't find anything in the General Assembly minutes or the board's minutes addressing that. I think there were probably some churches who were planning to use the new curriculum of the United Church, and it may be that they actually went ahead and used it for the first year. The reaction against the new curriculum didn't really start until like August or September of that year. So people would have already made plans to use the curriculum. PCC churches weren't obliged to buy the PCC curriculum or to use the recommendations, and so I think many of them might have thought, well, why not just use the UCC curriculum? But I couldn't find any official statements about it or anything.
I guess I'm going to keep quiet. I'm a graduate of yours.
Oh, good.
I was a librarian.
Good.
As well, afterward. We taught our students because there was so many churches, partly because of finances, I guess, who were very attracted to the commercial curriculums. Cook.
David C. Cook, yeah.
And Scripture Press.
Scripture Press,
what's
yeah.
the other one? There's three of them. It just escapes me. But we were taught how to compare curriculum, and that's why Europe had so much curriculum in the library.
Yes.
That added to our 11,000 something volumes because we had multiple copies at some points. But the students compared the curricula so they were able to help Christian education committees. Well, that's why we have the historical curriculum collection today, is because you were collected those samples. I need to talk to you probably. Which I'm going to talk to them about.
One of your points, I think, is one just worth considering, which is cost. That this became one of the things where the cost of doing it and the expectations seemed to grow. And I don't know if you want to add to that, but it just struck me that that was a really, really good point, because even in the middle of the war, I wonder if that isn't what drove them, because resources were pretty scarce then. Is that what drove them to consider it? But then they didn't want to. They wanted to it, but they couldn't actually afford it. And then after the war, the expectations of the production values, etc. And just so you know, the same thing happens later on when it comes to television. The Presbyterian Church in Canada is very interested in being involved in television and producing stuff, but they can't afford it.
You're absolutely right. And probably there was considerations about paper supplies and the cost of paper, especially like in 1948 when they were having serious financial difficulties. Probably the cost of paper or the shortage of paper was still going on after that. But so another paper that I did was on, it was comparing the new curriculum of the UCC to other curriculums of the time. And it's true, the production values of the curriculum in the 1950s and 1960s went up. So all of a sudden you had to have film strips and records and all kinds of stuff, and you had to have color illustrations and this and that and the other thing. And so there were all these wonderful curriculums out there. The PCC just could not compete with that.
I have wonderful memories of going to
Yes. I think it was fun for the kids, wasn't it? I mean, and, you know, yeah.
little stickers.
Yeah. And the songs.
And then you collect so many and you get a bigger one.
Yeah.
All that. Learning the skins.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not quite as old as this lady, but when I was growing up in Sunday school, packed and packed and packed with kids, there was no such a thing as curriculum. You had a Bible, a hymn book, and a shorter catechism. That was it.
Really?
That was it. You read a passage, you read it, you talked about it, you learned your catechism, and you learned a hymn. Go. End of story. So
okay, maybe you didn't know there was a curriculum.
Well, no, I did because this was in the Irish Presbyterian Church, because we had the same thing. We had Presbyterian exams every year, and it was just really, and everything. And you had to write, and you got a gold medal if you won the thing, and if you could do you got another special award if you could do the whole catechism from beginning to end, question and answer. And that was our curriculum. It was driven by those documents.
Did you get the gold medal?
I was trying to think. I was going to say yes, but I think. Let me put it like this. I tried hard.
A lot of it was taken out of church. Sorry, my voice. The Sunday school would you would come with your parents or children to church, and then you would go down for the sermon.
Mm.
So they didn't have a long period with the children.
No. I think that's often the pattern today. And when I was going to Sunday school, admittedly in a Baptist church, you had Sunday school beforehand, and then you went to the church. Mm.
So it was almost the opposite, that I loved whatever productions were coming our way
Yeah.
to learn from.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so we had lots of resources, and I enjoyed each and every one.
Yeah. It is interesting as I've been going through this curriculum collection just to see the spectrum of stuff that came out, and a lot of thought put into a lot of it. So.
Could you please join me in thanking Anne again? We promised we'd have you out of here by 3:30, and we're going to do that. But I think I would just like to thank everyone for what they've presented. There's been some really thought-provoking papers on many different topics. We've had some biographies. We've had a look at Sunday school curriculums. We've dealt with the Glasgow Colonial Society and one key minister there. And we've looked at mission to Indigenous peoples. So we've had a really rich day. And let's just thank all our presenters. And we look forward next year to another great conference. So please keep on our mailing list. Our thanks to Sid and Ian and Marilyn for all the work that they've done for bringing this together. And yes, and to Terry for keeping us online. And so thanks very much.